48. Utilitarian priorities. It was Saturday, the first morning of February, and at the Ravenclaw table, a boy bearing a breakfast plate heaped high with vegetables was nervously inspecting his servings for the slightest trace of meat. It might have been an overreaction. After he'd gotten over the raw shock, Harry's common sense had woken up and hypothesized that Parseltongue was probably just a linguistic user interface for controlling snakes. After all, snakes couldn't really be human-level intelligent, someone would have noticed by now. The smallest-brained creatures Harry had ever heard of with anything like linguistic ability were the African grey parrots taught by Irene Pepperberg. And that was unstructured proto-language, in a species that played complex games of adultery and needed to model other parrots. While according to what Draco had been able to remember, snakes spoke to parselmouths in what sounded like normal human language, i.e., full-blown recursive syntactical grammar. That had taken time for hominids to evolve, with huge brains and strong social selection pressures. Snakes didn't have much society at all that Harry had ever heard. And with thousands upon thousands of different species of snakes all over the world, how could they all use the same version of their supposed language, Parseltongue? Of course that was all merely common sense, in which Harry was starting to lose faith entirely. But Harry was sure he'd heard snakes hissing on the TV at some point. After all, he knew what that sounded like from somewhere, and that hadn't sounded to him like language, which had seemed a good deal more reassuring. At first, the problem was that Draco had also asserted that parselmouths could send snakes on extended complex missions. And if that was true, then parselmouths had to make snakes persistently intelligent by talking to them. In the worst-case scenario, that would make the snake self-aware, like what Harry had accidentally done to the Sorting Hat. And when Harry had offered that hypothesis, Draco had claimed that he could remember a story. Harry hoped to Cthulhu that this one story was just a fairy tale. It had that ring to it, but there was a story about Salazar Slytherin sending a brave young viper on a mission to gather information from other snakes. If any snake a parselmouth had talked to could make other snakes self-aware by talking to them, then Harry didn't even know why his mind was going all then, when he knew perfectly well how the exponential progression would work, it was just the sheer moral horror of it that was blowing his mind. And what if someone had invented a spell like that to talk to cows? What if there were poultry mouths? Or for that matter. Harry froze in sudden realization just as the furkful of carrots was about to enter his mouth. That couldn't possibly be true. Surely no wizard would be stupid enough to do that. And Harry knew, with a dreadful sinking feeling, that of course they would be that stupid. Salazar Slytherin had probably never considered the moral implications of snake intelligence for even 1 second, just like it hadn't ever occurred to Salazar that Muggleborns were intelligent enough to deserve personhood rights. Most people just didn't see moral issues at all unless someone else was pointing them out. Harry, said Terry from beside him, sounding like he was afraid he would regret asking. Why are you staring at your fork like that? I'm starting to think magic should be illegal, said Harry. By the way, have you ever heard any stories about wizards who could speak with plants? Terry hadn't heard of anything like that. Neither had any seventh-year Ravenclaws that Harry had asked. And now Harry had returned to his place, but not yet sat down again, staring at his plate of vegetables with a forlorn expression. He was getting hungrier, and later in the day he would be visiting Mary's place for one of their incredibly tasty dishes. Harry was finding himself sorely tempted to just revert back to yesterday's eating habits and be done with it. You've got to eat something, said his inner Slytherin. And it's not all that much more likely that anyone sneezed self-awareness onto poultry than onto plants, so as long as you're eating food of questionable sentience either way, why not eat the delicious deep-fried Dyracol slices? I'm not quite sure that's valid utilitarian logic there. Oh, you want utilitarian logic? One serving of utilitarian logic coming up, even in the unlikely chance that some moron did manage to confer sentience on chickens, it's your research that stands the best chance of discovering the fact and doing something about it. If you can complete your work even slightly faster by not messing around with your diet, then, counterintuitive as it may seem, the best thing you can do to save the greatest number of possibly sentient who knows what's is not wasting time on wild guesses about what might be intelligent. It's not like the house elves haven't prepared the food already, regardless of what you take onto your plate. Harry considered this for a moment. It was a rather seductive line of reasoning. Good, said Slytherin. I'm glad you see now that the most moral thing to do is to sacrifice the lives of sentient beings for your own convenience, to feed your dreadful appetites, for the sick pleasure of ripping them apart with your teeth. What? Harry thought indignantly. Which side are you on here? His inner Slytherin's mental voice was grim. You two will someday embrace the doctrine that the end justifies the means. This was followed by some mental snickering. Ever since Harry had started worrying that plants might also be sentient, his non-Ravenclaw components had been having trouble taking his moral caution seriously. Hufflepuff was shouting cannibalism every time Harry tried to think about any food item whatsoever, and Gryffindor would visualize it screaming while he ate it, even if it was, say, a sandwich. Cannibalism. Don't eat me. Ignore the screams, eat it anyway. It's a safe place to compromise your ethics in the service of higher goals. Everyone else thinks it's okay to eat sandwiches, so you can't use your usual rationalization about a small probability of a large downside if you get caught. Harry gave a mental sigh, and thought, just so long as you're okay with us being eaten by giant monsters that didn't do enough research into whether we were sentient. I'm okay with that, said Slytherin. Is everyone else okay with that? Internal mental nods. Great, can we go back to deep-fried Dyracol slices now? Not until I've done some more research into what's sentient and what isn't. Now shut up. And Harry turned firmly away from his plate full of oh-so-tempting vegetables to head toward the library. Just eat the students, said Hufflepuff. There's no doubt about whether they're sentient. You know you want to, said Gryffindor. I bet the young ones are the tastiest. Harry was starting to wonder if the Dementor had somehow damaged their imaginary personalities. Honestly, said Hermione. The young girl's voice sounded a little acerbic as her gaze scanned the bookshelves of the herbology stacks in the Hogwarts library. Harry had left her a message asking if she could come to the library after she'd finished breakfast, which Harry had skipped, but then when Harry had introduced the day's topic she'd seemed a bit nonplussed. You know your problem, Harry. You've got no sense of priorities. An idea gets into your head and you just go running straight off after it. I've got a great sense of priorities, said Harry. His hand reached out and grabbed Vegetable Cunning by Casey McNamara, and began to flip through the starting pages, searching for the table of contents. That's why I want to find out whether plants can talk before I eat my carrots. Don't you think that maybe the two of us have more important things to worry about? You sound just like Draco, Harry thought, but of course didn't say out loud. Out loud he said, what could possibly be more important than plants turning out to be sentient? There was a pregnant silence from beside him, as Harry's eyes went down the table of contents. There was indeed a chapter on plant language, causing Harry's heart to skip a beat, and then his hands began to rapidly turn the pages, heading for the appropriate page number. There are days, said Hermione Granger, when I really, truly, have absolutely no idea what goes on inside that head of yours. Look, it's a question of multiplication, okay. There's a lot of plants in the world. If they're not sentient, then they're not important, but if plants are people, then they've got more moral weight than all the human beings in the world put together. Now, of course your brain doesn't realize that on an intuitive level, but that's because the brain can't multiply. Like if you ask 3 separate groups of Canadian households how much they'll pay to save 2,000, 20,000, or 200,000 birds from dying in oil ponds, the 3 groups will respectively state that they're willing to pay $78, $88, and $80. No difference, in other words. It's called scope insensitivity. Your brain imagines a single bird struggling in an oil pond, and that image creates some amount of emotion that determines your willingness to pay. But no one can visualize even 2,000 of anything, so the quantity just gets thrown straight out the window. Now try to correct that bias with respect to 100 trillion sentient blades of grass, and you'll realize that this could be thousands of times more important than we used to think the whole human species was. Oh, thank Azathoth, this says it's just mandrakes that can talk and they speak regular human language out loud, not that there's a spell you can use to talk with any plant. Ron came to me at breakfast yesterday morning, Hermione said. Now her voice sounded a little quiet, a little sad, maybe even a little scared. He said he'd been dreadfully shocked to see me kiss you. That what you said while you were demented should have shown me how much evil you were hiding inside. And that if I was going to be a follower of a dark wizard, then he wasn't sure he wanted to be in my army anymore. Harry's hands had stopped turning pages. It seemed that Harry's brain, for all its abstract knowledge, was still incapable of appreciating scope on any real emotional level, because it had just forcibly redirected his attention away from trillions of possibly sentient blades of grass who might be suffering or dying even as they spoke, and toward the life of a single human being who happened to be nearer and dearer. Ron is the world's most gigantic prat, Harry said. They won't be printing that in the newspaper anytime soon, because it's not news. So after you fired him, how many of his arms and legs did you break? I tried to tell him it wasn't like that, Hermione went on in the same quiet voice. I tried to tell him you weren't like that, and that it wasn't like that between the two of us, but it just seemed to make him even more like he was. Well, yes, Harry said. He was surprised that he wasn't feeling angrier at Captain Weasley, but his concern for Hermione seemed to be overriding that for now. The more you try to justify yourself to people like that, the more it acknowledges that they have the right to question you. It shows you think they get to be your inquisitor, and once you grant someone that sort of power over you, they just push more and more. This was one of Draco Malfoy's lessons which Harry had thought was actually pretty smart. People who tried to defend themselves got questioned over every little point and could never satisfy their interrogators, but if you made it clear from the start that you were a celebrity and above social conventions, people's minds wouldn't bother tracking most violations. That's why when Ron came over to me as I was sitting down at the Ravenclaw table, and told me to stay away from you, I held my hand out over the floor and said, you see how high I'm holding my hand? Your intelligence has to be at least this high to talk to me. Then he accused me of, quote, sucking you into the darkness, unquote, so I pursed my lips and went schlurp, and after that his mouth was still making those talking noises, so I put up a quieting charm. I don't think he'll be trying his lectures on me again. I understand why you did that, Hermione said, her voice tight. I wanted to tell him off too, but I really wish you hadn't. It will make things harder for me, Harry. Harry looked up from vegetable cunning again. He wasn't getting any reading done at this rate, and he saw that Hermione was still reading whatever book she had, not looking up at him. Her hands turned another page even as he watched. I think you're taking the wrong approach by trying to defend yourself at all, Harry said. I really do think that. You are who you are. You're friends with whoever you choose. Tell anyone who questions you to shove it. Hermione just shook her head, and turned another page. Option 2, Harry said. Go to Fred and George and tell them to have a little talk with their wayward brother, those two are genuine good guys. It's not just Ron, Hermione said in almost a whisper. Lots of people are saying it, Harry. Even Mandy is giving me worried looks when she thinks I'm not looking. Isn't it funny? I keep worrying that Professor Quirrell is sucking you into the darkness, and now people are warning me just the same way I try to warn you. Well, yeah, said Harry. Doesn't that reassure you a bit about me and Professor Quirrell? In a word, said Hermione, no. There was a silence that lasted long enough for Hermione to turn another page, and then her voice, in a real whisper this time, and Padma is going around telling everyone that since I couldn't cast the Patronus charm, I must only be pretending to be nice. Padma didn't even try herself. Harry said indignantly. If you were a dark witch who was just pretending, you wouldn't have tried in front of everyone. Do they think you're stupid? Hermione smiled a little, and blinked a few times. Hey, I have to worry about actually going evil. Here the worst case scenario is that people think you're more evil than you really are. Is that going to kill you? I mean, is it all that bad? The young girl nodded, her face screwed up tight. Look, Hermione, if you worry that much about what other people think, if you're unhappy whenever other people don't picture you exactly the same way you picture yourself, that's already dooming yourself to always be unhappy. No one ever thinks of us just the same way we think of ourselves. I don't know how to explain to you, Hermione said in a sad soft voice. I'm not sure it's something you could ever understand, Harry. All I can think of to say is, how would you feel if I thought you were evil? Harry visualized it. Yeah, that would hurt. A lot. But you're a good person who thinks about that sort of thing intelligently. You've earned that power over me. It would mean something if you thought I'd gone wrong. I can't think of a single other student, besides you, whose opinion I'd care about the same way. You can live like that, whispered Hermione Granger. I can't. The girl had gone through another 3 pages in silence, and Harry had returned his eyes to his own book and was trying to regain his focus, when Hermione finally said, in a small voice, Are you really sure I mustn't know how to cast the Patronus charm? Harry had to swallow a sudden lump in his throat. He suddenly saw himself not knowing why the Patronus charm didn't work for him, not being able to show Draco, just being told that there was a reason, and nothing more. Hermione, your Patronus would shine with the same light, but it wouldn't be normal, it wouldn't look like people think Patronuses should look, anyone who saw it would know there was something strange going on. Even if I told you the secret, you couldn't demonstrate to anyone, unless you made them face the other way so they could only see the light, and the most important part of any secret is the knowledge that a secret exists. You could only show 1 or 2 friends if you swore them to secrecy. Harry's voice trailed off helplessly. I'll take it. Her voice was still small. It was very hard not to just blurt out the secret, right there in the library. I shouldn't, I really shouldn't, it's dangerous, Hermione, it could do a lot of harm if that secret got out. Haven't you heard the saying, 3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead? That telling just your closest friends is the same as telling everyone, because you're not just trusting them, you're trusting everyone they trust. It's too important, too much of a risk, it's not the sort of decision that should be made for the sake of fixing someone's reputation at school. Okay, Hermione said. She closed the book and put it back in the shelf. I can't concentrate right now, Harry, I'm sorry. If there's anything else I can do, be nicer to everyone. The girl didn't look back as she walked out of the stacks, which might have been a good thing, because the boy was frozen in place, unmoving. After a while, the boy started turning pages again. 49. Prior information. A boy waits at a small clearing at the edge of the non-forbidden forest, beside a dirt trail that runs back to the gates of Hogwarts in one direction, and off into the distance in another. There is a carriage nearby, and the boy is standing well away from it, looking at it, his eyes seldom wavering from its direction. In the distance, a figure is approaching along the dirt path, a man wearing professorial robes, trudging slowly with his shoulders slumped low, his formal shoes kicking up small clouds of dust as he walks. Half a minute later, the boy darts another quick glance before returning to his surveillance, and this glimpse shows that the man's shoulders have straightened, his face unslackened, and that his shoes are now walking lightly across the dirt, leaving not a trace of dust in the air behind. Hello, Professor Quirrell, Harry said without letting his eyes move again from the direction of their carriage. Salutations, said the calm voice of Professor Quirrell. You seem to be keeping your distance, Mr. Potter. I don't suppose you see something odd about our conveyance. Odd, Harry echoed. Why no, I can't say I see anything odd. There seem to be even numbers of everything. 4 seats, 4 wheels, 2 huge skeletal winged horses. A skin-wrapped skull turned to look at him and flashed teeth, solid and white in that black cavernous mouth, as though to indicate that it was just about as fond of him as he was of it. The other black leathery horse skeleton tossed its head like it was whickering, but there was no sound. They are Thestrals, and they have always drawn the carriage, Professor Quirrell said, sounding quite undisturbed as he climbed into the front bench of the carriage, sitting down as far to the right as possible. They are visible only to those who have seen death and comprehended it, a useful defense against most animal predators. I suppose that the first time you went in front of the Dementor, your worst memory proved to be the night of your encounter with he who must not be named. Harry nodded grimly. It was the right guess, even if for the wrong reasons. Those who have seen death. Did you recall anything of interest thereby? Yes, Harry said, I did, only that and nothing more, for he was not ready as yet to make accusations. The defense professor smiled one of his dry smiles, and beckoned with an impatient finger. Harry closed the distance and climbed into the carriage, wincing. The sense of doom had grown significantly stronger after the day of the Dementor, even though it had been slowly weakening before then. The greatest distance that the carriage allowed him from Professor Quirrell no longer seemed like nearly far enough. Then the skeletal horses trotted forward and the carriage started in motion, taking them toward the outer bounds of Hogwarts. As it did, Professor Quirrell slumped back down into zombie mode, and the sense of doom retreated, though it still hovered at the edge of Harry's perceptions, unignorable. The forest scrolled by as the carriage rolled along, the trees moving past at a speed that seemed positively glacial by comparison to broomsticks or even cars. There was something oddly relaxing, Harry thought, about traveling that slowly. It had certainly relaxed the defense professor, who was slumped over with a small stream of drool coming out of his slack mouth and puddling on his robes. Harry still hadn't decided what he was allowed to eat for lunch. His library research hadn't turned up any sign of wizards speaking to non-magical plants. Or any other non-magical animals besides snakes, although Spell and Speak by Paul Breedlove had recounted the probably mythical tale of a sorceress called the Lady of Flying Squirrels. What Harry wanted to do was ask Professor Quirrell. The problem was that Professor Quirrell was too smart. Judging by what Draco had said, the heir of Slytherin business was a major bombshell, and Harry wasn't sure he wanted anyone else to know. And the instant Harry asked about Parseltongue, Professor Quirrell would fix him with those pale blue eyes and say, I see, Mr. Potter, so you taught Mr. Malfoy the Patronus charm and accidentally spoke to his snake. It wouldn't matter that it shouldn't be enough evidence to locate the true explanation as a hypothesis, let alone overcome its burden of prior improbability. Somehow the defense professor would deduce it anyway. There were times when Harry suspected that Professor Quirrell had way more background information than he was telling, his priors were simply too good. Sometimes he got his amazing deductions right even when his reasons were wrong. The problem was that Harry couldn't see how Professor Quirrell could have snuck in an extra clue about half the stuff he guessed. Just once Harry would have liked to make some sort of incredible deduction from something Professor Quirrell said which would catch him completely off guard. I shall have a bowl of green lentil soup, with soy sauce, Professor Quirrell said to the waitress. And for Mr. Potter, a plate of Norman's family chili. Harry hesitated in sudden dismay. He'd resolved to stick to vegetarian dishes for the moment, but he'd forgotten in his deliberations that Professor Quirrell did the actual ordering, and it would be awkward if he protested now. The waitress bowed to them, and turned to go. Excuse me, any meat in that from snakes or flying squirrels? The waitress didn't so much as blink an eye, only turned back to Harry, shook her head, bowed politely to him again, and resumed her walk toward the door. The other parts of Harry were snickering at him. Gryffindor was making sardonic comments about how a little social discomfort was enough to get him to resort to cannibalism. Shouted by Hufflepuff, and Slytherin was remarking on how nice it was that Harry's ethics were flexible when it came to important goals like maintaining his relationship with Professor Quirrell. After the waitress had closed the door behind her, Professor Quirrell waved a hand to slide home the locking bar, spoke the usual 4 charms to ensure privacy, and then said, An interesting question, Mr. Potter. I wonder why you asked it. Harry kept his face steady. I was looking up some facts about the Patronus charm earlier, he said. According to the Patronus charm, wizards who could and couldn't, it turns out that Godric couldn't and Salazar could. I was surprised, so I looked up the reference, in 4 Lives of Power. And then I discovered that Salazar Slytherin could supposedly talk to snakes. Temporal sequence wasn't the same as causation, it wasn't Harry's fault if Professor Quirrell missed that. Further research turned up an old story about a mother goddess type who could talk to flying squirrels. I was a bit worried about the prospect of eating something that could talk. And Harry took a casual sip of his water. Just as Professor Quirrell said, Mr. Potter, would I be correct in guessing that you are also a Parselmouth? When Harry was done coughing, he set his glass of water back down on the table, fixed his gaze on Professor Quirrell's chin rather than looking him in the eyes, and said, "So you are able to perform legilimency through my occlumency barriers, then?" Professor Quirrell was grinning widely. "I shall take that as a compliment, Mr. Potter, but no. I'm not buying this anymore," Harry said. "There's no way you came to that conclusion based on that evidence." "Of course not," Professor Quirrell said equably. "I had planned to ask you that question today in any case, and simply chose an opportune moment. I have suspected since December, in fact." "December," said Harry. "I found out yesterday." "Ah, so you did not realize the Sorting Hat's message to you was in Parseltongue." The defense professor had timed it exactly right the second time, too, just as Harry was taking a gulp of water to clear out his throat from the first coughing fit. Harry hadn't realized, not until just now. Of course it was obvious the instant Professor Quirrell said it. Right, Professor McGonagall had even told him not to talk to snakes where anyone could see him, but he thought she'd meant not to be seen talking to any statues or architectural features in Hogwarts that looked like snakes. Double illusion of transparency, he thought he understood her, she thought he understood her, but how the hell? "So," Harry said, "you performed legilimency on me during my first defense class, to find out what happened with the Sorting Hat." "Then I would not have found out in December." Professor Quirrell leaned back, smiling. "This is not a puzzle you can solve on your own, Mr. Potter, so I will reveal the answer. Over the winter holiday, I was alerted to the fact that the headmaster had filed a request for a closed judicial panel to review the case of one Mysterubus Hagrid, whom you know as the keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts, and who was accused of the murder of Abigail Myrtle in 1943. "Oh, of course," said Harry, "that makes it downright obvious that I'm a Parselmouth." "Professor, what the sweet slithering snakes?" The other suspect for that murder was Slytherin's monster, the legendary inhabitant of Slytherin's Chamber of Secrets. Which is why certain sources alerted me to the fact, and why it caught my attention sufficiently that I spent a good deal of bribe money to learn the details of the case. Now in point of fact, Mr. Potter, Mr. Hagrid is innocent. Ridiculously obviously innocent. He is the most blatantly innocent bystander to be convicted by the magical British legal system since Grindelwald's confunding of Neville Chamberlain was pinned on Amanda Knox. Headmaster Dippet prompted a student puppet to accuse Mr. Hagrid because Dippet needed a scapegoat to take the blame for the death of Miss Myrtle, and our marvelous justice system agreed that this was plausible enough to warrant Mr. Hagrid's expulsion and the snapping of his wand. Our current headmaster needs merely provide some new item of evidence significant enough to reconvene the case, and with Dumbledore applying pressure instead of Dippet, the result is a foregone conclusion. Lucius Malfoy has no particular reason to fear Mr. Hagrid's vindication, thus Lucius Malfoy will only resist to the extent that he can do so costlessly in order to impose costs on Dumbledore, and Dumbledore is clearly willing to prosecute the case regardless. Professor Quirrell took a sip of his water. "But I digress. The new evidence that the headmaster promises to provide is to exhibit a previously undetected spell on the Sorting Hat, which, the headmaster asserts, he has personally determined to respond only to Slytherins who are also Parselmouths. The headmaster further argues that this favors the interpretation that the Chamber of Secrets was indeed opened in 1943, approximately the right time frame for he who must not be named, a known Parselmouth, to have attended Hogwarts. It is a rather questionable logic, but a judicial panel may rule that it swings the case far enough to bring Mr. Hagrid's guilt into doubt, if they can manage to keep a straight face as they say it. And now we come to the key question: how did the headmaster discover this hidden spell on the Sorting Hat?" Professor Quirrell was smiling thinly now. "Well now, let us suppose that there was a Parselmouth in this year's crop of students, a potential heir of Slytherin. You must admit, Mr. Potter, that you stand out as a possibility whenever extraordinary people are considered. And if I then further ask myself which new Slytherin would be most likely to have his mental privacy invaded by the headmaster, specifically hunting the memories of his sorting, why, you stand out even more." The smile vanished. "So you see, Mr. Potter, it was not I who invaded your mind, though I will not ask you to apologize. It is not your fault that you believed Dumbledore's protestations of respecting your mental privacy." "My sincere apologies," Harry said, keeping his face expressionless. The rigid control was a confession in its own right, as was the sweat beading his forehead, but he didn't think the defense professor would take any evidence from that. Professor Quirrell would just think Harry was nervous at having been discovered as the heir of Slytherin, rather than being nervous that Professor Quirrell might realize that Harry had deliberately betrayed Slytherin's secret, which itself was no longer seeming like such a smart move. "So, Mr. Potter, any progress on finding the Chamber of Secrets?" "No," thought Harry. But to maintain plausible deniability, you needed a general policy of sometimes evading questions even when you had nothing to hide. "With respect, Professor Quirrell, if I had made such progress, it is not quite obvious to me that I should tell you about it." Professor Quirrell sipped from his own water glass again. "Well then, Mr. Potter, I shall freely tell you what I know or suspect. First, I believe the Chamber of Secrets is real, as is Slytherin's monster. Miss Myrtle's death was not discovered until hours after her demise, even though the wards should have alerted the headmaster instantly. Therefore her murder was performed either by Headmaster Dippet, which is unlikely, or by some entity which Salazar Slytherin keyed into his wards at a higher level than the headmaster himself. Second, I suspect that contrary to popular legend, the purpose of Slytherin's monster was not to rid Hogwarts of Muggleborns. Unless Slytherin's monster were powerful enough to defeat the headmaster of Hogwarts and all the teachers, it could not triumph by force. Multiple murders in secrecy would result in the school's closure, as nearly happened in 1943, or in the placing of new wards. So why Slytherin's monster, Mr. Potter? What true purpose does it serve? Ah, Harry dropped his gaze to his water glass and tried to think. To kill anyone who got into the chamber and didn't belong there. A monster powerful enough to defeat a team of wizards that had broken past the best wards Salazar could place on his chamber. Unlikely. Harry was feeling a bit pressured now. Well, it's called the Chamber of Secrets, so maybe the monster has a secret, or is a secret. For that matter, just what sort of secrets were in the Chamber of Secrets in the first place? Harry hadn't done a lot of research on the subject, in part because he'd gotten the impression that nobody knew anything. Professor Quirrell was smiling. Why not just write the secret down? Ah, said Harry, because if the monster spoke Parseltongue, that would ensure that only a true descendant of Slytherin could hear the secret. Easy enough to key the wards on the chamber to a phrase spoken in Parseltongue. Why go to the trouble of creating Slytherin's monster? It cannot have been easy to create a creature with a lifespan of centuries. Come, Mr. Potter, it should be obvious, what are the secrets that can be told from one living mind to another, but never written down? Harry saw it then, with a burst of adrenaline that started his heart racing, his breath coming faster. Oh. Salazar Slytherin had been very cunning indeed. Cunning enough to come up with a way to bypass the interdict of Merlin. Powerful wizardries couldn't be transmitted through books or ghosts, but if you could create a long-lived enough sentient creature with a good enough memory. It seems very probable to me, said Professor Quirrell, that he who must not be named began his climb to power with secrets obtained from Slytherin's monster. That Salazar's lost knowledge is the source of you-know-who's extraordinarily powerful wizardry. Hence my interest in the Chamber of Secrets and the case of Mr. Hagrid. I see, Harry said. And if he, Harry, could find Salazar's Chamber of Secrets, then all of the lost knowledge that Lord Voldemort had obtained would be his as well. Yes, that was just how the story should go. Add in Harry's superior intelligence and some original magical research and some Muggle rocket launchers, and the resulting fight would be completely one-sided, which was exactly how Harry wanted it. Harry was grinning now, a very evil grin. New priority, find everything in Hogwarts that looks remotely like a snake and try speaking to it. Starting with everything you've already tried, only this time be sure to use Parseltongue instead of English, get Draco to let you into the Slytherin dorms. Don't become too excited, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell. His own face had become expressionless, now. You must continue thinking. What were the Dark Lord's parting words to Slytherin's monster? What? Harry said. How could either of us possibly know that? Visualize the scene, Mr. Potter. Let your imagination fill in the details. Slytherin's monster, probably some great serpent, so that only a Parselmouth may speak to it, has finished imparting all of the knowledge it possesses to he who must not be named. It conveys to him Salazar's final benediction, and warns him that the Chamber of Secrets must now remain closed until the next descendant of Salazar should prove cunning enough to open it. And he who will become the Dark Lord nods, and says to it. Avada Kedavra, said Harry, suddenly feeling sick to his stomach. Rule 12, Professor Quirrell said quietly. Never leave the source of your power lying around where someone else can find it. Harry's gaze dropped to the tablecloth, which had decorated itself in a mournful pattern of black flowers and shadows. Somehow that seemed too sad to be imagined. Slytherin's great snake had only wanted to help Lord Voldemort, and Lord Voldemort had just. There was something unbearably sorrowful about it. What sort of person would do that to a being who'd offered them nothing but friendship? Do you think the Dark Lord would have? Yes, Professor Quirrell said flatly. He who must not be named left quite a trail of bodies behind him, Mr. Potter. I doubt he would have omitted that one. If there were any artifacts left there that could be moved, the Dark Lord would have taken those with him as well. There might still be something worth seeing in the Chamber of Secrets, and to find it would prove yourself the true heir of Slytherin. But do not raise your hopes too high. I suspect that all you will find is the remains of Slytherin's monster resting quietly in its grave. They sat in silence for a while. I could be wrong, said Professor Quirrell. In the end it is only a guess. But I did wish to warn you, Mr. Potter, so that you would not be too sorely disappointed. Harry nodded shortly. One might even regret your infant self's victory, said Professor Quirrell. His smile twisted. If only you know who had lived, you might have persuaded him to teach you some of the knowledge that would have been your heritage from one heir of Slytherin to another. The smile twisted further, as though to mock the obvious impossibility, even given the premise. Note to self, thought Harry, with a slight chill and an edge of anger, make sure to extract my heritage out of the Dark Lord's mind, one way or another. There was another silence. Professor Quirrell was looking at Harry as though waiting for him to ask something. Well, said Harry, so long as we're on the topic, can I ask how you think the whole Parselmouth business actually? There came a knock at the door, then. Professor Quirrell raised a cautionary finger, then opened the door with a wave. The waitress entered, balancing a huge platter with their meals as though the whole assembly weighed nothing, which was in fact probably the case. She gave Professor Quirrell his bowl of green soup, and a glass of his usual Chianti, and set down before Harry a plate of small meat strips smothered in a heavy-looking sauce plus a glass of his accustomed treacle soda. Then she bowed, managing to make it seem like sincere respect rather than perfunctory acknowledgement, and departed. When she was gone, Professor Quirrell held up a finger for silence again, and drew his wand. And then Professor Quirrell began performing a certain series of incantations that Harry recognized, making him take a sharp breath. It was the series and ordering that Mr. Bester had used, the full set of 27 spells that you would perform before discussing anything of truly great import. If the discussion of the Chamber of Secrets hadn't counted as important. When Professor Quirrell was done, he'd performed 30 spells, 3 of which Harry hadn't heard before. The defense professor said, "Now we shall not be interrupted for a time. Can you keep a secret, Mr. Potter?" Harry nodded. "A serious secret, Mr. Potter," Professor Quirrell said. His eyes were intent, his face grave. "One which could potentially send me to Azkaban. Think about it before you reply." For a moment Harry didn't even see why the question should be hard, given his growing collection of secrets. Then, if this secret could send Professor Quirrell to Azkaban, that means he's done something illegal. Harry's brain performed a few calculations. Whatever the secret, Professor Quirrell did not think his illegal act would reflect badly on him in Harry's eyes. There was no advantage to be gained from not hearing it. And if it did reveal something wrong with Professor Quirrell, then it was very much to Harry's advantage to know it, even if he had promised not to tell anyone. "I never had very much respect for authority," Harry said. "Legal and governmental authority included. I will keep your secret." Harry didn't bother asking whether the revelation was worth the danger it would pose to Professor Quirrell. The defense professor wasn't stupid. "Then I must test whether you are truly a descendant of Salazar," said Professor Quirrell, and stood up from his chair. Harry, prompted more by reflex and instinct than calculation, shoved himself up out of his own chair as well. There was a blur, a shift, a sudden motion. Harry aborted his panicked backward leap halfway through, leaving him windmilling his arms and trying not to fall over, a frantic flush of adrenaline running through him. At the other end of the room swayed a snake a meter high, bright green and intricately banded in white and blue. Harry didn't know enough snakelore to recognize it, but he knew that, brightly colored, meant poisonous. The constant sense of doom had diminished, ironically enough, after the defense professor of Hogwarts had turned into a venomous snake. Harry swallowed hard and said, "Greetings, HSSSS, no, greetings." "SSO, hissed the snake. "USS Peak, I hear. ISS Peak, you hear." "Yes, I hear," hissed Harry. "You are an animagus." "Obviously," hissed the snake. 37 Rulus, number 34, become animagus. All sensible people do, if can. Thus, very rare. The snake's eyes were flat surfaces ensconced within dark pits, sharp black pupils in dark gray fields. This ISS most secure way to SS Peak. You see, no others understand USS. Even if they are SS Snake Animagi. Not unless heir of Slytherin wills. The snake gave a series of short hisses which Harry's brain translated as sardonic laughter. Slytherin not a stupid. SS Snake Animagus not SSA Mesperselmouth. Would be huge flaw in Sishem. Well, that definitely argued that Parseltongue was personal magic, not snakes being sentient beings with a learnable language. "I am not registered," hissed the snake. The dark pits of its eyes stared at Harry. "Animagus must be registered. Penalty is 2 years imprisonment. Will you keep my secret, boy?" "Yes," hissed Harry. "Would never break promise." The snake seemed to hold still, as though in shock, and then began to sway again. "We come here next in 7 days. Bring cloak to pass unseen, bring hourglass to move through time." "You know," hissed Harry in shock. "How?" Again the series of short quick hisses that translated as sardonic laughter. "You arrive in my first class while SS till another class, a strike down enemy with pi 2 balls of memory." "Never mind," hissed Harry. "A stupid question, forgot you were SS smart." "Foolish thing to forget," said the snake, but the hiss did not seem offended. "Hourglass is restricted," Harry said. "Cannot us until 9th hour." The snake twitched its head, a snakish nod. "Many restrictions. Locked to your us only, cannot be SS Tolan. Cannot transport other humans. But SS Snake carried in pouch, I suspect will go with. Think possible to hold hourglass motionless within S shell, without disturbing wards, while you turn S shell around it. We will test in 7 days. Will not SS peak of plants beyond this. USSA nothing, to no one. Give no sign of expectancy, none. Understand? Harry nodded. Answer in SS Peach. Yes. Will do as ISSA'd. Yes. But, Harry gave a wobbling rasp. That was how his mind had translated a hesitant into snakish. I do not promise to do whatever this ISS, you have not SSA'd. The snake performed a shiver that Harry's mind translated as a severe glare. Of course not. We'll discuss SS specifics at next meeting. The blur in motion reversed itself, and Professor Quirrell was standing there once more. For a moment the defense professor himself seemed to sway, as the snake had swayed, and his eyes seemed cold and flat, and then his shoulders straightened and he was human once more. And the aura of doom had returned. Professor Quirrell's chair scooted back for him, and he sat down in it. No sense in letting this go to waste, Professor Quirrell said as he picked up his spoon, though at the moment I would much prefer a live mouse. One can never quite disentangle the mind from the body it wears, you see. Harry slowly took his seat and began eating. So the line of Salazar did not die with you-know-who after all, said Professor Quirrell after a time. It would seem that rumors have already begun to spread, among our fine student body, that you are dark. I wonder what they would think, if they knew that. Or if they knew that I had destroyed a Dementor, Harry said, and shrugged. I figure all the fuss will blow over the next time I do something interesting. Hermione is having trouble, though, and I was wondering if you might have any suggestions for her. The defense professor ate several spoonfuls of soup in silence, then, and when he spoke again, his voice was oddly flat. You really care about that girl? Yes, Harry said quietly. I suppose that is why she was able to bring you out of your dementation. More or less, Harry said. The statement was true in a way, just not exact. It was not that his demented self had cared, but that it had been confused. I did not have any friends like that when I was young. Still the same emotionless voice. What would have become of you, I wonder, if you had been alone? Harry shivered before he could stop himself. You must be feeling grateful to her. Harry just nodded. Not quite exact, but true. Then here is what I might have done at your age, if there had been anyone to do it for. 50. Self-centeredness. Padma Patil had finished her dinner a little late, getting on toward 7:30, and was now striding quickly out of the great hall on her way to the Ravenclaw dorm and the study rooms. Gossiping was fun and destroying Granger's reputation was more fun, but it could distract from schoolwork. She'd put off a 6-inch essay on Lomeliolar would due in next morning's herbology class, and she needed to finish it tonight. It was while she was passing through a long, twisting, narrow stone corridor that the whisper came, sounding like it was coming from right behind her. Padma Patil. She spun around quick as lightning, her wand already snatched up from a pocket of her robes and leaping into her hands, if Harry Potter thought he could sneak up on and scare her that easily. There was no one there. Instantly Padma spun around and looked in the other direction, if it had been a ventriloquism charm. There was no one there, either. The whispering sigh came again, soft and dangerous with a slight hissing undertone. Padma Patil, Slytherin girl. Harry Potter, Slytherin boy, she said out loud. She'd fought Potter and his Chaos Legion a dozen times over, and she knew that this was Harry Potter doing this somehow. Even though the ventriloquism charm was only line of sight, and in the winding corridor, she could easily see all the way to the nearest twist both forward and backward, and there was no one there. It didn't matter. She knew her enemy. There was a whispery chuckle, now coming from beside her, and she spun around and pointed her wand at the whisper and shouted, Luminous. The red bolt of light shot out and struck the wall, which lit with a crimson glow that soon faded. She hadn't really expected it to work. Harry Potter couldn't possibly be invisible, not really invisible, that was magic most grown-ups couldn't do, and she'd never believed 9/10 of the stories about him. The whispery voice laughed again, now on her other side. Harry Potter stands on the precipice, whispered the voice, now sounding very close to her ear. He is wavering, but you are already falling, Slytherin girl. The hat never called out Slytherin for my name, Potter. She backed up against the wall, so she wouldn't have to watch behind herself, and raised her wand in an attack stance. Again the soft laugh. Harry Potter has been in the Ravenclaw common room for the last half hour, helping Kevin Entwistle and Michael Corner rehearse potions recipes. But it matters not. I am here to deliver a warning to you, Padma Patil, and if you choose to ignore it that is your own affair. Fine, she said coldly. Go ahead and warn me, Potter, I'm not afraid of you. Slytherin was a great house, once, said the whisper, it sounded sadder, now. Slytherin was once a house you would have been proud to choose, Padma Patil. But something turned wrong, something turned sour. Do you know what went awry in Slytherin House, Padma Patil? No, and I don't care. But you should care, said the whisper, now sounding like it was coming from just behind her head where it stood almost pressed against the wall. For you are still that girl whom the Sorting Hat offered that choice. Do you think that just choosing Ravenclaw means that you are not Pansy Parkinson, and will not ever become Pansy Parkinson, no matter how you conduct yourself otherwise? Despite everything, now, small chills of fear were spreading out from her spine and running over her skin. She'd heard those stories about Harry Potter too, that he was a secret Legilimens. But she still stood straight, and she put all the bite she could into her voice when she said, "The Slytherins went dark to get power, just like you did, Potter. And I won't, not ever." "But you'll spread vicious rumors about an innocent girl," whispered the voice, "even though it will not help you attain any of your own ambitions, and without considering that she has powerful allies who might take offense. That is not the proud Slytherin of the old days, Padma Patil. That is not the pride of Salazar. That is Slytherin gone rotten, Padma Parkinson, not Padma Malfoy." She was getting more creeped out than she ever had been in her life, and the possibility was starting to occur to her that this might really be a ghost. She hadn't ever heard that ghosts could hide themselves like this, but maybe they just didn't usually do it, not to mention that most ghosts weren't this eerie, they were just dead people after all. "Who are you?" "The Bloody Baron." When Harry Potter was bullied and beaten, the voice whispered, he commanded all his allies to refrain from vengeance. "Do you remember that, Padma Patil?" For Harry Potter is wavering, but not yet lost, he is struggling, he knows himself to be in peril. But Hermione Granger made no such request of her own allies. "Harry Potter is angered with you now, Padma Patil, more angered than he would ever be on his own behalf. And he has allies of his own." A shudder went through her, she knew that it was visible and she hated herself for it. "Oh, don't be afraid," breathed the voice. "I will not hurt you. For you see, Padma Patil, Hermione Granger truly is innocent. She does not stand on the precipice, she is not falling. She did not ask her allies to refrain from hurting you, because the thought did not even occur to her as a possibility. And Harry Potter knows very well that if he hurt you or caused you to be hurt, for Hermione Granger's sake, then she would never speak to him again until the sun burned low and the last star failed in the night sky." The voice was very sad now. "She truly is a kindly girl, a person such as I could only wish to be." "Granger can't cast the Patronus charm," said Padma, "if she was really as nice as she pretends to be. Can you cast the Patronus charm, Padma Patil? You dared not even attempt it, you feared what the result would be." "That's not true. I didn't have time, that was all." The whisper continued. But Hermione Granger did try, openly before her friends, and when her magic failed she was surprised and dismayed. For there are secrets to the Patronus charm that few ever knew, and maybe none now know but I. A soft, whispery chuckle. Let it stand that it is no stain of her spirit that halts her light from coming forth. Hermione Granger cannot cast the Patronus charm for the very same reason that Godric Gryffindor, who raised these halls, never could. The corridor was becoming colder, she was certain of it, as though someone were using the chilling charm. And Harry Potter is not Hermione Granger's only ally. Now there was an undertone of dry amusement in that whisper, it reminded her suddenly and frighteningly of Professor Quirrell. "Phileas Flitwick and Minerva McGonagall are quite fond of her, I do believe. Did it occur to you that if those two learned what you were doing to Hermione Granger, they might become less fond of you? They might not intervene openly, perhaps, but they might be a little slower to award you house points, a little slower to steer opportunities your way." Potter snarked on me. A ghostly chuckle, a dry ha. "Do you think those two are stupid, deaf and blind?" In a sadder whisper, "Do you think Hermione Granger is not precious to them, that they will not see her hurting? As they might have been fond of you once, their bright young Padma Patil, but you are throwing it away." Padma's throat was dry. She hadn't thought of that, not at all. "I wonder how many people will end up caring for you, Padma Patil, on this path that you now tread. Is it worth it much, just to distance yourself further from your sister? To be the shadow to Parvati's light? Your deepest fear has always been to fall into harmony with her, back into harmony with her I should say, but is it worth hurting an innocent girl, just to make yourself that much more different? Must you be the evil twin, Padma Patil, can you not find a different good to pursue?" Her heart was hammering in her chest. She'd never talked about that with anyone. "I have always wondered at how students bully each other," sighed the voice. "How children make life difficult for themselves, how they turn their schools into prisons even with their own hands. Why do human beings make their own lives so unpleasant? I can give you a part of the answer, Padma Patil. It is because people do not stop and think before causing pain, if they do not imagine that they themselves could also be hurt, that they might also suffer from their own misdeeds. But suffer you will, oh, yes, Padma Patil, suffer you will, if you stay on this road. You will suffer the same pain of loneliness, the same pain of others' fear and distrust that you now inflict on Hermione Granger. Only for you it will be deserved." Her wand was shaking in her hand. "You did not choose sides when you went to Ravenclaw, girl. You choose your side by the way you live your life, what you do to other people and what you do to yourself. Will you illuminate others' lives, or darken them? That is the choice between light and dark, not any word the Sorting Hat cries out. And the hard part, Padma Patil, is not saying, light, the hard part is deciding which is which, and admitting it to yourself when you begin down the wrong road." There was silence. It went on for a time, and Padma realized that she had been dismissed. Padma almost dropped her wand, when she tried to put it back into her pocket. She almost fell, when she took a step forward away from the wall, and turned to go. I have not always chosen rightly between light and dark, the whisper said, now loud and harsh directly into her ear. Do not take my wisdom as a final word, girl, do not fear to question it, for though I tried I have sometimes failed, oh, yes, I have failed. But you are hurting a true innocent, and you will achieve none of your ambitions by doing so, it is not for any cunning plan. You are inflicting pain purely for the sake of the pleasure it brings you. I have not always chosen rightly between light and dark, but that I know for darkness, for certain. You are hurting an innocent girl, and escaping retribution only because she is too kindly to tolerate her allies moving against you. I cannot hurt you for that, so know only that I cannot respect it. You are unworthy of Slytherin, go and do your herbology homework, Ravenclaw girl. The final whisper came out in a louder hiss that sounded almost like a snake, and Padma fled. She fled down the corridors like lethifolds were chasing her. She ran heedless of the rules about running in the corridors. Even when she passed other students who looked at her in surprise, she did not stop. She ran all the way to the Ravenclaw dorms with her pulse pounding in her neck. The door asked her, why does the sun shine in the day instead of the nighttime? And it took her 3 tries before she could make her answer coherent, and then the door came open and she saw a few girls and boys, some young and some old, all staring at her, and in one corner at the pentagonal table, Harry Potter and Michael Corner and Kevin Entwistle, looking up from their textbooks. Sweet Merlin! Exclaimed Penelope Clearwater, rising from a couch. What happened to you, Padma? She stuttered. I heard a ghost. It wasn't the Bloody Baron, was it? Said Clearwater. She drew her wand and a moment later she was holding a cup, and then an aguamenti later the cup was filled with water. Here, drink this, sit down. Padma was already striding toward the pentagonal table. She looked at Harry Potter, who was looking at her with his own gaze, calm and grave and a little sad. You did this, Padma said. How dare you? There was a sudden hush in the Ravenclaw dorm. Harry just looked at her and said, is there anything I can help you with? Don't deny it, Padma said, her voice shaking. You set that ghost on me, it said. I mean it, Harry said. Can I help you with anything? Get you some food, or go fetch a soda for you, or help you with your homework, or anything like that. Everyone was staring at the two of them. Why? Padma said. She couldn't think of anything else to say, she didn't understand. Because some of us are standing on the precipice, Harry said. And the difference is what you do for other people. Will you let me help you with something, Padma, please? She stared at him, and knew, in that moment, that he'd gotten his own warning, same as her. She said. I've got to write 6 inches on Lomolealer. Let me run up to my dorm room and get my herbology stuff, Harry said. He rose from the pentagonal table, looked at Entwistle and Corner. Sorry, guys, I'll see you later. They didn't say anything, just stared, along with everyone else in the dorm room, as Harry Potter walked over to the stairs. And just as he started up, he said, and no one's to pester her with questions unless she wants to talk about it. I hope everyone's got that. Got it, said most of the first years and some of the older students, a few of them sounding quite scared. And she talked about a lot of things with Harry Potter besides Lomolealer wood, even her fear of falling back into harmony with Parvati, which she'd never talked about with anyone before, but then Harry's ghostly ally already knew. And Harry had reached into his pouch and pulled out some odd books, loaning them to her on condition of complete secrecy, saying that if she could comprehend those books it would change the pattern of her thinking enough that she'd never fall into harmony with Parvati again. At 9 o'clock, when Harry said he had to go, the essay was only half done. And when Harry paused, and looked at her on the way out, and said that he thought she was worthy of Slytherin, it made her feel good for a whole minute before she realized what had just been said to her and who had said it. When Padma got down to breakfast, that morning, she saw Mandy see her and whisper something to the girl sitting beside her at the Ravenclaw table. She saw that girl get up from the bench and walk toward her. Last night Padma had been glad that girl roomed in the other dorm, but now that she thought about it, this was worse, now she had to do it in front of everyone. But even though Padma was sweating, she knew what she had to do. The girl came closer. I'm sorry. What? Said Padma. That was her line. I'm sorry, repeated Hermione Granger. Her voice was loud so that everyone could hear. I didn't ask Harry to do that, and I was angry with him when I found out, and I made him promise not to do it again to anyone, and I'm not talking to him for a week. I'm really sorry, Miss Potter. Hermione Granger's back was stiff, her face was stiff, you could see the sweat on her face. Said Padma. Her own thoughts were pretty much scrambled, now. Padma's gaze flicked to the Ravenclaw table, where one boy was watching them with tight eyes and his hands clenched in his lap. Earlier. I told you to be nicer. Shrieked Hermione. Harry was starting to sweat. He'd never actually heard Hermione scream at him before, and it was quite loud in the empty classroom. But I was nice. Harry protested. I practically redeemed her. Padma was going down the wrong path and I turned her off it. I probably changed her whole life to be happier. Besides, you should have heard the original version of what Professor Quirrell suggested I do, at which point Harry realized what he was saying and closed his mouth a second too late. Hermione clutched at her chestnut curls, a gesture Harry hadn't seen from her before. What did he say to do? Kill her. The defense professor had suggested that Harry identify all the key influential students inside and outside his year and try to gain control of the entire Hogwarts rumor mill, remarking that this was a generally useful and amusing challenge for any true Slytherin attending Hogwarts. Nothing like that, Harry said quickly. He just said in a general way that I should get influence over the people spreading rumors, and I decided that the nice version of that would be to just inform Padma directly about the meaning of what she was doing, and the possible consequences of her actions, instead of trying to threaten her or anything like that. You call that not threatening someone? Hermione's hands were pulling at her hair now. Harry said. I guess she might have felt a little threatened, but Hermione, people will do whatever they think they can get away with. They don't care about how much it hurts other people if it doesn't hurt themselves. If Padma thinks there's no consequences to spreading lies about you, then of course she'll just go on doing it. And you think there's going to be no consequences to what you did? Harry got a sudden sick feeling to his stomach. Hermione had the angriest look on her that he'd ever seen. What do you think the other students think of you now, Harry? Of me. If Harry doesn't like the way you talk about Hermione, you'll get ghosts set on you. Is that what you want them to think? Harry opened his mouth and no words came out. He just hadn't thought about it that way, actually. Hermione reached down to grab her books from the table where she'd slammed them. I'm not talking to you for a week, and I'll tell everyone I'm not talking to you for a week, and I'll tell them why, and maybe that'll undo some of what you just did. And after that week, I'll decide then what to do, I guess. Hermione. Harry's own voice rose to a shriek of desperation. I was trying to help. The girl turned back and looked at him as she opened the classroom door. Harry, she said, and her voice trembled a little beneath the anger, Professor Quirrell is sucking you into the darkness. He really is. I mean it, Harry. This wasn't him. This wasn't what he said to do. This was just me. Hermione's voice was almost a whisper now. Someday you're going to go out to lunch with him, and it will be your dark side that comes back, or maybe even you won't come back at all. I promise you, Harry said, that I will come back from lunch. He wasn't even thinking as he said it. And Hermione just turned around and strode out and slammed the door behind her. Way to invoke the laws of dramatic irony, moron, observed Harry's internal critic. Now you're going to die this Saturday. Your last words will be, I'm sorry, Hermione, and she'll always regret that the last thing she did was slam the door. Oh, shut up. When Padma sat down with Hermione for breakfast, and said in a voice loud enough for others to hear that the ghost had just told her things that were important for her to hear, and Harry Potter had been right to do it, there were some people who were less frightened afterward, and some who were frightened more. And afterward people did say fewer nasty things about Hermione, at least in the first year, at least in public where Harry Potter might hear about it. When Professor Flitwick asked Harry if he was responsible for what had happened to Padma, and Harry said yes, Professor Flitwick told him that he was to serve 2 days detention. Even if it had only been a ghost and Padma hadn't been hurt, still, that wasn't acceptable behavior for a Ravenclaw student. Harry nodded and said that he understood why the professor had to do that, and wouldn't protest, but considering that it did seem to have turned Padma around, did Professor Flitwick really think, off the record, that he'd done the wrong thing? And Professor Flitwick paused, seeming to actually think about it, and then said to Harry, in a solemnly squeaky voice, that he needed to learn how to relate to other students the normal way. And Harry couldn't help but think that this was advice that Professor Quirrell would never give him. Harry couldn't help but think that if he'd done it Professor Quirrell's way, the normal Slytherin way, a mixture of positive and negative incentives to bring Padma and the other rumor mongers under his explicit control, then Padma wouldn't have talked about it, and Hermione would have never found out. In which case Padma wouldn't have been redeemed, she would have stayed on the wrong path, and she herself would have suffered from that eventually. It wasn't as if Harry had lied to Padma in any way, when he was time-turned and invisible and using the ventriloquism charm. Harry still wasn't sure whether he'd done the right thing, or a right thing, and Hermione hadn't relented on not talking to him, though she was talking a lot with Padma. It hurt more than Harry had expected, going back to studying by himself, like his brain had already started to forget its long-honed skill of being alone. The days until Saturday's lunch with Professor Quirrell seemed to go by very, very slowly. 51. Title redacted, PT1. Saturday. Harry had run into trouble falling asleep Friday night, which he had anticipated might happen, and so he had decided to take the obvious advance precaution of buying a sleeping potion, and to prevent it from constituting a visible sign that he was nervous, he had decided to buy it off Fred and George a couple of months earlier. Be prepared, that's the Boy Scouts marching song. Thus Harry was fully rested, and his pouch contained almost everything which he owned and might conceivably need. Harry had, in fact, run into the volume limitation on the pouch, and keeping in mind that he would need to store a large snake, and might need to store who knew what else, he had removed some of the bulkier items, like the car battery. He was up to the point now where he could transfigure something the size of a car battery in 4 minutes flat, so it wasn't much of a loss. Harry had kept the emergency flares and the oxyacetylene welding torch and fuel tank, since you couldn't just transfigure things that were to be burned. Be prepared, as through life you march along. Mary's place. After the waitress had taken their order and bowed to them and left the room, Professor Quirrell had performed only 4 charms, and then they'd talked about nothing of any vast consequence, just Professor Quirrell's complex thesis about how the Dark Lord's curse on the defense position had led to the decline of dueling and how this had changed social customs in magical Britain. Harry listened and nodded and said intelligent things, while he tried to control the pounding of his heart. Then the waitress came in again bearing their food, and this time, a minute after the waitress had departed, Professor Quirrell gestured for the door to close and lock, and began to speak 29 security charms, one of the ones in Mr. Bester's sequence being left out this time, which somewhat puzzled Harry. Professor Quirrell finished his charms, stood up from his chair, blurred into a green snake banded in blue and white, hissed, "Hungry, boy. Eat your fill swiftly, we shall need both the strength and time." Harry's eyes were a bit wide, but he hissed, "I ate well at breakfast," and then rapidly began forking noodles into his mouth. The snake watched him for a moment, with those flat eyes, and then hissed, "Do not wish to explain here. Prefer to be elsewhere first. Need to leave unobserved, without SSine we have ever departed room." "SSO no one can track USS, hissed Harry. "Yes. Do you trust me that much, boy? Think before answer. I will have important request of you, which requires trust. If SSA no regardless, then SSA no now." Harry dropped his gaze from the snake's flat eyes, and looked back down at his sauce-coated noodles, and ate another bite, then another, while he thought. The defense professor was an ambiguous figure, to put it mildly. Harry thought he had unraveled some of his goals, but others remained mysterious. But Professor Quirrell had knocked down 200 girls to stop the ones summoning Harry. Professor Quirrell had deduced that the Dementor was draining Harry through his wand. The defense professor had saved Harry's life twice, in a 2-week period. Which could mean that the defense professor was just saving Harry for later, that there were ulterior motives. Indeed, it was certain that there were ulterior motives. Professor Quirrell wasn't doing this on a whim. But then Professor Quirrell had also seen Harry taught occlumency, he had taught Harry how to lose. If the defense professor wanted to make some use of Harry Potter, it was a use that required a strengthened Harry Potter, not a weakened one. That was what it meant to be used by a friend, that they would want the use to make you stronger instead of weaker. And if there was sometimes a cold atmosphere about the defense professor, bitterness in his voice or emptiness in his gaze, then Harry was the only one who Professor Quirrell allowed to see it. Harry didn't quite know how to describe in words the sense of kinship he felt with Professor Quirrell, except to say that the defense professor was the only clear-thinking person Harry had met in the wizarding world. Sooner or later everyone else started playing Quidditch, or not putting protective shells on their time machines, or thinking that death was their friend. It didn't matter how good their intentions were. Sooner or later, and usually sooner, they demonstrated that something deep inside their brain was confused. Everyone except Professor Quirrell. It was a bond that went beyond anything of debts owed, or even anything of personal liking, that the two of them were alone in the wizarding world. And if the defense professor occasionally seemed a little scary or a little dark, well, that was just the same thing some people said about Harry. "I trust you," hissed Harry. And the snake explained the first stage of the plan. Harry took a final furkful of noodles, chewed. Beside him, Professor Quirrell, now in human form again, was eating his soup placidly, as though nothing of special interest were occurring. Then Harry swallowed, and in the same moment stood up from his chair, already feeling his heart start to hammer hard in his chest. The security precautions they were taking were literally the most stringent possible. "Are you ready to test it, Mr. Potter?" Professor Quirrell said calmly. It wasn't a test, but Professor Quirrell wouldn't say that, not out loud in human speech, even in this room screened to the limit that Professor Quirrell had secured with further charms. "Yep," Harry said as casually as he could. "Step 1. Harry said, cloak to his pouch, drew forth the cloak of invisibility, and then unstuck the pouch from his belt and threw it toward the other side of the table. The defense professor stood up from his own seat, drew his wand, bent down, and touched his wand to the pouch, murmuring a quiet incantation. The new enchantments would ensure that Professor Quirrell could enter the pouch on his own in snake form, and leave it on his own, and hear what went on outside while he was in the pouch. Step 2. As Professor Quirrell stood up from where he'd bent over by the pouch, and put away his wand happened to point in Harry's direction, and there was a brief crawling sensation on Harry's chest near where the time turner lay, like something creepy had passed very close by without touching him. Step 3. The defense professor turned into a snake again, and the sense of doom diminished. The snake crawled to the pouch and into it, the pouch's mouth opening to admit the green shape, and as the mouth closed again behind the tail, the sense of doom diminished further. Step 4. Harry drew his wand, being careful to stand still as he did it so that the time turner would not move from where Professor Quirrell had anchored the hourglass within the shell in its current orientation. Wingardium Leviosa, murmured Harry, and the pouch began to float toward him. Slowly, slowly, as Professor Quirrell had instructed, the pouch began to float toward Harry, who waited alert for any sign the pouch was opening, in which case Harry was to use the hover charm to propel it away from him as fast as possible. As the pouch came within a meter of Harry, the sense of doom returned. As Harry reattached the pouch to his belt, the sense of doom was stronger than it had ever been, but still not overwhelming. It was tolerable. Even with Professor Quirrell's animagus form lying within the extended space of the pouch resting on Harry's very hip. Step 5. Harry sheathed his wand. His other hand still held the cloak of invisibility, and Harry drew that cloak over himself. Step 6. And so in that room, shielded from every possible scrying, which Professor Quirrell had personally and further secured, it was not until after Harry was wearing the true cloak of invisibility that he reached beneath his shirt and twisted the outer shell of the time turner just once. The time turner's inner hourglass stayed anchored and motionless, the setting twisted around it. The food vanished from the table, the chairs leapt back into place, the door sprang open. Mary's room was deserted, as it should have been, because Professor Quirrell had earlier contacted Mary's place under a false name to inquire whether the room would be available at this hour, not to reserve it, not to place a cancelled reservation that might be noted, but only to inquire. Step 7. Staying under the cloak of invisibility, Harry left through the open door. He navigated the tiled hallways of Mary's place to the well-stocked bar that greeted new entrants, tended by the owner, Jake. There were only a few people at the bar, in the morning before proper lunchtime, and Harry had to wait invisibly by the door for several minutes, listening to the murmur of conversation and the gurgle of alcohol, before the door opened to admit a huge genial Irishman, and Harry slipped out silently in his wake. Step 8. Harry walked for a while. He was well away from Mary's place when he turned off Diagon Alley into a smaller alley, at the end of which lay a shop that was dark, the windows enchanted to blackness. Step 9. Swordfish melon friend, Harry spoke the passphrase to the lock, and it clicked open. Within the shop was also darkness, the light from the open door briefly illuminating it to show a wide, empty room. The furniture shop which had once operated here had gone bankrupt a few months ago, according to the defense professor, and the shop had been repossessed, but not yet resold. The walls were painted a simple white, the wooden floor scratched and unpolished, a single closed door set in the back wall. This had been a showroom, once, but now it showed nothing. The door clicked shut behind Harry, and then the darkness was pitch and complete. Step 10. Harry took out his wand and said, Lumos, lighting the room with white glow. He took his pouch from his belt, the sense of doom growing a little sharper as he grasped it with his fingers, and lightly tossed it to the opposite side of the room, the sense of doom fading almost completely. And then he began to take off the cloak of invisibility, even as his voice hissed, It is done. Step 11. From the pouch poked a green head, followed shortly by a meter-long green body as the snake slithered out. A moment later, the snake blurred into Professor Quirrell. Step 12. Harry waited in silence while the defense professor recited 30 charms. All right, Professor Quirrell said calmly, when he had finished. If anyone is still watching us now, we are in any case doomed, so I will speak plainly and in human form. Parseltongue does not quite suit me, I fear, as I am neither a descendant of Salazar nor a true snake. Harry nodded. So, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell. His gaze intent, his pale blue eyes dark and shadowed in the white light coming from Harry's wand. We are alone and unobserved, and I have an important question to ask you. Go ahead, said Harry, his heart starting to beat faster. What is your opinion of the government of magical Britain? That wasn't quite what Harry had been expecting, but it was close enough, so Harry said, based on my limited knowledge, I would say that both the Ministry and the Wizengamot appear to be stupid, corrupt, and evil. Correct, Professor Quirrell said. Do you understand why I ask? Harry took a deep breath, and looked Professor Quirrell straight in the eyes, unflinching. Harry had finally worked out that the way to make amazing deductions from scanty evidence was to know the answer in advance, and he had guessed this answer fully a week ago. It needed only a slight adjustment. You are about to invite me to join a secret organization full of interesting people like yourself, said Harry, one of whose goals is to reform or overthrow the government of magical Britain, and yes, I'm in. There was a slight pause. I'm afraid that is not quite where I intended to direct this conversation, said Professor Quirrell. The corners of his lips were twitching slightly. I merely planned to ask for your help in doing something extremely treasonous and illegal. Darn, thought Harry. Still, Professor Quirrell hadn't denied it. Go on. Before I do, said Professor Quirrell. There was no levity in his voice, now. Are you open to such requests, Mr. Potter? I say again that if you are likely to say no regardless, you must say no now. If your curiosity impels you otherwise, squash it. Treasonous and illegal doesn't bother me, said Harry. Risks bother me and the stakes would need to be commensurate, but I can't imagine you taking risks frivolously. Professor Quirrell nodded. I would not. It is a terrible abuse of my friendship with you, and of such trust as is placed in my teaching position at Hogwarts. You can skip this part, Harry said. The lips twitched again, and then went flat. Then I shall skip it. Mr. Potter, you sometimes make a game of lying with truths, playing with words to conceal your meanings in plain sight. I, too, have been known to find that amusing. But if I so much as tell you what I hope we shall do this day, Mr. Potter, you will lie about it. You will lie straight out, without hesitation, without wordplay or hints, to anyone who asks about it, be they foe or closest friend. You will lie to Malfoy, to Granger, and to McGonagall. You will speak, always and without hesitation, in exactly the fashion you would speak if you knew nothing, with no concern for your honor. That also is how it must be. There was silence, then, for a time. That was a price measured in a fraction of Harry's soul. Without telling me yet, said Harry, can you say if the need is desperate? There is someone in the most terrible want of your help, Professor Quirrell said simply, and there is no one who can help them but you. There was another silence, but not a long one. All right, Harry said quietly. Tell me of the mission. The dark robes of the defense professor seemed to blur against the shadow on the wall, cast by his silhouette blocking the white light of Harry's wand. The ordinary Patronus charm, Mr. Potter, wards off a Dementor's fear. But the Dementors still see you through it, they know that you are there. Only not your Patronus charm. It blinds them, or more than blinds them. What I saw beneath the cloak wasn't even looking in our direction as you killed it, as though it had forgotten our existence, even as it died. Harry nodded. That wasn't surprising, not when you confronted a Dementor on the level of its true existence, beyond anthropomorphism. Death might be the last enemy, but it wasn't a sentient enemy. When humanity had wiped out smallpox, smallpox hadn't fought back. Mr. Potter, the central branch of Gringotts is guarded by every spell high and low that the goblins know. Even so those vaults have been successfully robbed, for what wizardry can do, wizardry can undo. And yet no one has ever escaped from Azkaban. No one. For every charm there is a counter-charm, for every ward there is a bypass. How can it be that no one has ever been rescued from Azkaban? Because Azkaban has something invincible, Harry said. Something so terrible that no one can defeat it. That was the keystone of their perfect security, it had to be, nothing human. It was death that guarded Azkaban. The Dementors don't like their meals being taken away from them, Professor Quirrell said. Coldness had entered that voice, now. They know if anyone tries. There are more than 100 Dementors there, and they speak to the guards as well. It's that simple, Mr. Potter. If you're a powerful wizard, then Azkaban isn't hard to enter, and it isn't hard to leave. So long as you don't try to take anything out of it that belongs to the Dementors. But the Dementors are not invincible, said Harry. He could have cast the Patronus charm with that thought, in that very moment. Never believe that they are. Professor Quirrell's voice was very quiet. Do you remember what it was like when you went before the Dementor, the first time, when you failed? I remember. And then with a sudden sickening lurch in his stomach, Harry knew where this was going, he should have seen it before. There is an innocent person in Azkaban, Professor Quirrell said. Harry nodded, there was a burning sensation in his throat, but he didn't cry. The one of whom I speak was not under the Imperious curse, said the defense professor, dark robes silhouetted against a greater shadow. There are surer ways to break wills than the Imperious, if you have the time for torture, and legilimency, and rituals of which I will not speak. I cannot tell you how I know this, how I know any of this, cannot hint at it even to you, you will have to trust me. But there is a person in Azkaban who never once chose to serve the Dark Lord, who has spent years suffering alone in the most terrible cold and darkness imaginable, and never deserved a single minute of it. Harry saw it in a single leap of intuition, his mouth racing almost ahead of his thoughts. There was no hint, no warning, we all thought. A person by the name of Black, Harry said. There was silence. Silence, while the pale blue eyes stared at him. Well, said Professor Quirrell after a while. So much for not telling you the name until after you had accepted the mission. I would ask whether you're reading my mind, but that's flatly impossible. Harry said nothing, but it was simple enough if you believed in the processes of modern democracy. The most obvious person in Azkaban to be innocent was the one who hadn't gotten a trial. I am certainly impressed, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell. His face was grave. But this is a serious matter, and if there is some way others could make the same deduction, I must know. So tell me, Mr. Potter. How in the name of Merlin, of Atlantis, and the void between the stars, did you guess that I was talking about Bellatrix? 52. The Stanford Prison Experiment, PT2. The adrenaline was already flowing in Harry's veins, his heart already hammering in his chest, there in that darkened and bankrupt store. Professor Quirrell had finished explaining, and in one hand, Harry held a tiny wooden twig that would be the key. This was it, this was the day and the moment when Harry started acting the part. His first true adventure, a dungeon to be pierced, an evil government to be defied, a maiden in distress to be rescued. Harry should have been more frightened, more reluctant, but instead he felt only that it was time and past time to start becoming the people he had read about in his books, to begin his journey toward what he had always known he was meant to be, a hero. To take the first step on the road that led to Kimball Kinnison and Captain Picard and Leono of Thundera, and definitely not Raceland Mahire. So far as Harry's brain knew from watching early morning cartoons, when you grew up you were supposed to gain amazing powers and save the universe. That was what Harry's brain had seen adults doing and adopted as its role model for the maturation process, and Harry very much wanted to start growing up. And if the pattern of the story called for the hero to lose some part of his innocence, as the result of his first adventure, then for now, at least, in this still innocent moment, it seemed time and past time for him to experience that pain. Like casting off clothes too small for him, or like finally advancing to the next stage of the game, after being stuck for 11 years on World 3, Level 2 of Super Mario Bros. Harry had read enough novels to suspect that he wouldn't feel this enthusiastic afterward, so he was enjoying it while it lasted. There was a popping sound as something near Harry disappeared, and then there was no more time for heroic brooding. Harry's hand snapped the small wooden twig. A hook yanked motionlessly at Harry's abdomen as the portkey activated, feeling like a much harder pull this time than the smaller transports between the Hogwarts grounds and Diagon Alley. And dropped him into the middle of a huge roll of thunder dying away, and a lash of cold rain whipping him across the face, the water coating Harry's glasses and blinding him in an instant, turning the world into a blur even as he began to fall toward the raging ocean waves far below. He had arrived high above the empty North Sea. The shock of the blasting storm almost made Harry let go of the broomstick that Professor Quirrell had given him, which would not have been a good idea. It took nearly a full second for Harry to get his wits together and bring his broomstick back up in an easy swoop. "I'm here," said an unfamiliar voice from a patch of empty air above him, low and gravelly, the voice of the sallow lanky bearded man Professor Quirrell had polyjuiced into before disillusioning himself and his broomstick. "I'm here," Harry said from beneath the cloak of invisibility. He hadn't used polyjuice himself. Wearing a different body hindered your magic, and Harry might need all of his little magic about him, thus the plan called for Harry to stay invisible at nearly all times, instead of polyjuicing. Neither of them had spoken the other's name. You simply didn't use your names at any point during an illegal mission, even invisibly hovering over an anonymous patch of water in the North Sea. You simply didn't. It would be stupid. Carefully keeping a grip on the broomstick with one hand, while the rain and wind howled around him, Harry raised his wand in an equally careful grip and improvised his glasses. Then, with the lenses clear, Harry looked around. He was surrounded by wind and rain. It might have been 5 degrees Celsius if he was lucky. He'd already had a warming charm cast on himself just from being outside in February, but it wasn't standing up to the driving cold droplets. Worse than snow, the rain soaked into every exposed surface. The cloak of invisibility turned all of you invisible, but it didn't cover all of you, and that meant it didn't protect all of you from rain. Harry's face was exposed to the full force of the driven water, and it was driving straight into his neck and soaking down into his shirt, also the sleeves of his robes and the cuffs of his pants and his shoes. The water took every bit of cloth as an avenue to sneak in. "This way," said the polyjuiced voice, and a spark of green light lit up in front of Harry's broomstick, and then darted away in a direction that seemed to Harry like every other direction. Through the blinding rain, Harry followed. He lost it sometimes, that small green spark, and each time he did, Harry called out, and the spark would reappear in front of him a few seconds later. When Harry had caught the trick of following the spark, it accelerated, and Harry kicked the broomstick into high gear and followed. The rain whipped him harder, feeling like Harry imagined it must feel to get a face full of shotgun pellets, but his glasses stayed clear and protected his eyes. It was only a few minutes later, at the broomstick's full speed, that Harry caught a glimpse of a huge shadow through the rain, towering far across the waters. And felt a distant, hollow echo of emptiness radiating from where death waited, washing over Harry's mind and parting around it, like a wave breaking on stone. Harry knew his enemy this time, and his will was steel in all of the light. "I can already feel the Dementors," said the gravelly voice of the polyjuiced Quirrell. "I did not expect that, not this soon." "Think of the stars," Harry said, over a distant rumble of thunder. "Don't allow any anger in you, nothing negative, just think of the stars, what it feels like to forget yourself and fall bodilessly through space. Hold to that thought like an occlumency barrier across your entire mind. The Dementors will have some trouble reaching past that." There was silence for a moment, then, interesting. The green spark lifted, and Harry inclined his broomstick slightly upward to follow, even as it steered them into a fogbank, a cloud hovering low on the waters. Soon they were hovering above and slightly oblique of the huge three-sided metal building, as it loomed far below. The triangle of steel was hollow, not solid. It was a building of 3 thick solid walls and no center. The Aurors on guard roomed in the top level and southern side of the building, Professor Quirrell had said, protected by their Patronus charms. The legal entrance into Azkaban was on the roof of the southwest corner of the building. Which the two of them wouldn't use, of course. Instead, they would use a corridor that ran directly beneath the northern corner of the building. Professor Quirrell would go down first, and puncture a hole in the roof and its wards right at the northern tip, leaving behind an illusion to cover the gap. The prisoners were kept in the side of the building, in levels corresponding to their crimes. And at the bottom, in the uttermost center and depth of Azkaban, lay a nest of more than 100 Dementors. Loads of dirt were occasionally dropped in to keep up the level, as the matter directly exposed to the Dementors broke down into mud and nothingness. "Wait 1 minute," said the rough voice, "follow me at speed, and pass through with care." "Got it," Harry said lowly. The spark winked out, and Harry began to count, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. 61,000, and Harry dived, the wind shrieking around him as he dived, down toward the vast metal structure, down toward where he could feel the shadows of death waiting for him, draining light and radiating emptiness, as the metal structure grew larger and larger. Plain and featureless loomed the vast gray shape, but for a single raised box-like structure in the southwest corner. The north corner was simply blank, Professor Quirrell's hole undetectable. Harry pulled up sharply as he approached the north corner, giving himself more safety margin than he would have bothered with in flying classes, but not too much. As soon as he'd come to a halt, he began to slowly lower his broomstick again, toward what looked like the solid roof of the tip of the north corner. Descending through the illusory roof while invisible was a strange experience, and then Harry found himself in a metal corridor lighted with a dim orange light which, Harry realized after a startled glance, was coming from an old-fashioned mantled gas lamp. Dot for magic would fail, be drained away after a time, in the presence of Dementors. Harry dismounted his broom. The pull of the emptiness was stronger now, as it parted and flowed around Harry without touching him. They were distant but they were many, the wounds in the world, Harry could have pointed to them with his eyes closed. "Cast your Patronus," hissed a snake from the floor, looking more discolored than green in the dim orange light. The note of stress came through even in Parseltongue. Harry was surprised. Professor Quirrell had said that animagi in their animagus forms were much less vulnerable to Dementors. For the same reason the Patronuses were animals, Harry assumed. If Professor Quirrell was in this much trouble in his snake form, what had been happening to him while he was in the human form that let him use his magic? Harry's wand was already rising in his hand. This would be the beginning. Even if it was only one person, just one person that he could save from the darkness, even if he wasn't powerful enough yet to teleport all of Azkaban's prisoners to safety and burn the triangular hell down to bedrock. Even so, it was a start, it was a beginning, it was a down payment on everything that Harry meant to accomplish with his life. No more waiting, no more hoping, no more mere promising, it would all begin here. Here and now. Harry's wand slashed down to point at where the Dementors waited far below. Expecto Patronum. The glowing humanoid figure blazed up into existence. It wasn't the sun-bright thing that it had been before. Probably because Harry hadn't quite been able to stop himself from thinking about all the other prisoners in their cells, the ones that he wasn't here to save. It might be for the best, though. Harry would need to keep this Patronus going for a while, and it might be better if it wasn't quite so bright. The Patronus dimmed a little further, at that thought, and then further again, as Harry tried to put a little less of his strength into it, until finally the brilliant humanoid figure was glowing only slightly brighter than the brightest animal Patronus, and Harry felt that he could dim it no further without risking losing it entirely. And then, "ISSSS table," Harry hissed, and began feeding his broomstick into his pouch. His wand stayed in his hand, and a slight sustainable flow from him replaced the slight losses from his Patronus. The snake blurred into the form of a lanky, sallow man, holding Professor Quirrell's wand in one hand and a broomstick in the other. The lanky man staggered as he came back into existence, and went to lean against the wall for a moment. "Well done, if perhaps a trifle slow," murmured the gravelly voice. Professor Quirrell's dryness was in it, even though it didn't fit the voice, nor did the grave look on the thickly bearded face. "I cannot feel them at all, now." A moment later, the broomstick went into the man's robes and vanished. Then the man's wand rose and tapped on his head, and with a sound like a cracking eggshell he disappeared once more. Within the air blossomed a faint green spark, and Harry, still enshrouded in the cloak of invisibility, followed after. If you had been watching from outside, you would have seen nothing but a small green spark drifting through the air, and a brilliantly silver humanoid walking after it. They went down, and down, and down, passing gas lamp after gas lamp, and the occasional huge metal door, descending into Azkaban within what seemed like utter silence. Professor Quirrell had set up some type of barrier by which he could hear what went on nearby, but no sounds could pass outward, and no sounds could reach Harry. Harry hadn't quite been able to stop his mind from wondering why the silence, or stop his mind from giving the answer. The answer he'd already known on some wordless level of anticipation that had prompted him to futilely try not to think about it. Somewhere behind those huge metal doors, people were screaming. The silver humanoid figure wavered, brightening and dimming, every time Harry thought about it. Harry had been told to cast a bubblehead charm on himself. To prevent himself from smelling anything. All the enthusiasm and heroism had worn off already, as Harry had known it would. It hadn't taken long even by his standards. The process had completed itself the very first time they passed one of those metal doors. Every metal door was locked with a huge lock, a lock of simple unmagical metal that wouldn't have stopped a first-year Hogwarts student, if you still had a wand, if you still had your magic, which the prisoners didn't. Those metal doors were not the doors of individual cells, Professor Quirrell had said. Each one opened into a corridor in which there would be a group of cells. Somehow that helped a little, not thinking that each door corresponded directly to a prisoner who was waiting right behind it. Instead, there might be more than one prisoner, which diminished the emotional impact, just like the study showing that people contributed more when they were told that a given amount of money was required to save one child's life than when told the same total amount was needed to save 8 children. Harry was finding it increasingly hard not to think about it, and every time he did, the light of his Patronus fluctuated. They came to the place where the passageway turned left, at the corner of the triangular building. Once again there were descending metal steps, another flight of stairs, once again they went down. Mere murderers were not put into the lowest of cells. There was always a lower place you could go, an even worse punishment to fear. No matter how low you had already sunk, the government of magical Britain had some threat remaining against you if you did even worse. But Bellatrix Black had been the Death Eater who inspired more fear than anyone save Lord Voldemort himself, a beautiful and deadly sorceress absolutely loyal to her master. She had been, if such a thing were possible, more sadistic and evil even than you-know-who, as though she were trying to outdo her master. That was what the world knew of her, what the world believed of her. But before then, Professor Quirrell had told Harry, before the debut of the Dark Lord's most terrible servant, there had been a girl in Slytherin who had been quiet, keeping mostly to herself, harming no one. Afterward there had been made-up stories told about her, memories changing in retrospect. Harry knew well the research on that. But at the time, while she still attended school, the most talented witch in Hogwarts had been known as a gentle girl, Professor Quirrell had said. Her few friends had been surprised when she'd joined the Death Eaters, and more surprised that she'd been hiding so much darkness behind that sad, wistful smile. That was who Bellatrix had once been, the most promising witch of her own generation, before the Dark Lord stole her and broke her, shattered her and reshaped her, binding her to him on a deeper level and with darker arts than any Imperius. 10 years Bellatrix had served the Dark Lord, killing who he bade her kill, torturing who he bade her torture. And then the Dark Lord had finally been defeated. And Bellatrix's nightmare had continued. Somewhere inside Bellatrix there might be something that was still screaming, that had been screaming the whole time, something a psychiatric healer could bring back, or there might not be. Professor Quirrell had no way of knowing. But either way, they could. They could at least get her out of Azkaban. Bellatrix Black had been put into the lowest level of Azkaban. Harry was having trouble not imagining what he would see when they got to her cell. Bellatrix must have had almost no fear of death, in the beginning, if she was still alive at all. They descended another flight of stairs, coming that much closer to death and Bellatrix, the clacking of their invisible shoes the only sound that Harry could hear. Dim orange light coming from the gas lights, the faint green spark drifting through the air, the shining figure following with its silver light fluctuating from time to time. After descending many times, they came in time to a corridor that did not end in stairs, and a final metal door, and the green spark halted before it. Harry's heart had calmed a little, as they descended far into the depths of Azkaban without anything happening. But now it was hammering his chest once more. They were at the bottom, and the shadows of death were very close at hand. A soft metal click came from the lock, as Professor Quirrell opened the way. Harry took a deep breath and remembered everything that Professor Quirrell had told him. The hard part wouldn't just be getting the pretended personality right enough to fool Bellatrix Black herself, the hard part would be keeping his Patronus going at the same time. The green spark winked out, and a moment later a meter-high snake shimmered into existence, no longer invisible. The metal door moved with a slow creaking sound as Harry pushed on it with his invisible hand, opened it just a crack, and peered through. He saw a straight corridor that terminated in solid stone. There was no light there but what crept in from Harry's Patronus. That was bright enough for him to see the outer bars of the 8 cells set into the corridor, but he couldn't see the insides. More importantly, though, he didn't see anyone in the corridor itself. I see nothing, hissed Harry. The snake darted on ahead, swiftly twisting across the floor. A moment later, SSHEISS alone, hissed the snake. Stay, Harry thought to his Patronus, which took up a position just to one side of the door, as though guarding it, and then Harry pushed the door open further, and followed within. The first cell Harry looked at contained a desiccated corpse, skin gone gray and mottled, flesh worn through in places to expose the bone beneath, no eyes. Harry shut his eyes. He could still do that, he was still invisible, he wasn't betraying anything by shutting his eyes. He'd known it already, he'd read it on page 6 of his Transfiguration book, that you stayed in Azkaban until your prison term was done. If you died before it was up they kept you there until they released your corpse. If your term was for life, they just left the body in the cell until the cell was needed, at which point they threw your body into the Dementor's pit. But it was still a shock to see that corpse had been a person who'd just been left there. The light in the room wavered. Steady, thought Harry in his core. It wouldn't be good for Professor Quirrell if that Patronus went out from his thinking sad thoughts. This near to the Dementors, the defense professor might just fall dead where he stood. Steady, Harry James Potter Evans Veras, steady. With that thought, Harry opened his eyes again. There wasn't time to waste. The second cell he looked at contained only a skeleton. And behind the bars of the third cell he saw Bellatrix Black. Something precious and irreplaceable inside Harry withered like dry grass. You could tell the woman wasn't a skeleton, that her head wasn't a skull, because the texture of skin was still different from the texture of bone, no matter how white and pale she'd become, waiting in the dark alone. Either they weren't feeding her much, or what she ate, the shadows of death drained from her, for her eyes seemed shrunken below their lids, her lips looked too shriveled to close over her teeth. The color seemed leached out of the black clothing she had worn into prison, like the Dementors had drained that too. They'd been meant to be daring, those clothes, and now they lay loosely over a skeleton, exposing shriveled skin. I'm here to save her, I'm here to save her, I'm here to save her, Harry thought to himself, desperately, over and over with an effort like occlumency, willing his Patronus not to go out, to stay and protect Bellatrix from the Dementors. In his heart, in his core, Harry held to all his pity and his compassion, his will to save her from the darkness, the silver radiance coming in through the open door brightened, even as he thought it. And in another part of him, like he was just letting another part of his mind carry out a habit without paying much attention to it. A cold expression came over Harry's face, invisibly beneath the hood. Hello, my dear Bella, said a chill whisper. Did you miss me? 53. The Stanford Prison Experiment, PT3. The corpse of a woman opened her eyes, and the dull sunken orbs gazed out at nothing. Mad, Bellatrix muttered in a cracked voice, it seems that little Bella is going mad. Professor Quirrell had instructed Harry, calmly and precisely, how he was to act in Bellatrix's presence, how to form the pretense he would maintain in his mind. You found it expedient, or perhaps just amusing, to make Bellatrix fall in love with you, to bind her to your service. That love would have persisted through Azkaban, Professor Quirrell had said, because to Bellatrix it would not be a happy thought. She loves you utterly, completely, with her whole being. You do not return her love, but consider her useful. She knows this. She was the deadliest weapon you possessed, and you called her your dear Bella. Harry remembered it from the night the Dark Lord killed his parents, the cold amusement, the contemptuous laughter, that high-pitched voice of deathly hate. It didn't seem at all difficult to guess what the Dark Lord would say. I hope you are not mad, Bella dear, said the chill whisper. Mad is not useful. Bellatrix's eyes flickered, tried to focus on empty air. My Lord, I waited for you but you did not come. I looked for you but I could not find you. You are alive. All her words came out in a low mutter, if there was emotion in it, Harry could not tell. Is how her your face, hissed the snake at Harry's feet. Harry cast back the hood of the cloak of invisibility. The part of him that Harry had placed in control of his facial expressions looked at Bella without the slightest trace of pity, only cool, calm interest. While in his core, Harry thought, I will save you no matter what. The scar, muttered Bellatrix. That child. So they all still think, said Harry's voice, and gave a thin little chuckle. You looked for me in the wrong place, Bella dear. Harry had asked why Professor Quirrell couldn't be the one to play the part of the Dark Lord, and Professor Quirrell had pointed out that there was no plausible reason for him to be possessed by the shade of he who must not be named. Bellatrix's eyes remained fixed on Harry, she said no word. SSA Swamathing in Purseltong, hissed the snake. Harry's face turned to the snake to make it clear that he was addressing it, and hissed, 1 2 3 4 5 SSIX 7 8 9 10. There was a pause. Those who do not fear the darkness, murmured Bellatrix. The snake hissed, will be consumed by it. Will be consumed by it, whispered the chill voice. Harry didn't particularly want to think about how Professor Quirrell had gotten that password. His brain, which thought about it anyway, suggested that it had probably involved a Death Eater, a quiet isolated place, and some lead pipe legilimency. Your wand, murmured Bellatrix, I took it from the potter's house and hid it, my lord. Under the tombstone to the right of your father's grave. Will you kill me, now, if that was all you wished of me? I think I must have always wanted you to be the one to kill me. But I can't remember now, it must have been a happy thought. Harry's heart wrenched inside him, it was unbearable, and he couldn't cry, couldn't let his Patronus fade. Harry's face showed a flicker of annoyance, and his voice was sharp as it said, enough foolishness. You're to come with me, Bella dear, unless you prefer the company of the Dementors. Bellatrix's face twitched in brief puzzlement, the shrunken limbs did not stir. You'll need to float her out, Harry hissed to the snake. SSHE can no longer think of escaping. Yes, hissed the snake, but do not underestimate her, SSHE was as the deadliest of warriors. The green head dipped in warning. One would be wise to fear me, boy, even were I a starved and 9/10 dead, be wary of her, allow no single flaw in your pretense. The green snake smoothly glided out of the door. And shortly after, a man with sallow skin and a fearful expression on his bearded face cringed into the room with his wand in hand. My lord, the servant said falteringly. Do as you were instructed, the Dark Lord whispered in that chill voice, sounding even more terrible coming from a child's body. And do not let your Patronus falter. Remember, if I do not return there will be no reward for you, and it will be long before your family is allowed to die. Having spoken those dreadful words, the Dark Lord pulled his invisibility cloak over his head, and disappeared. The cringing servant opened the door to Bellatrix's cage, and pulled a tiny needle from his robes with which he poked the human skeleton. The single drop of red blood produced was soon absorbed into a small doll, which was laid upon the floor, and the servant began to chant in a whisper. Soon another living skeleton lay upon the floor, motionless. Afterward the servant seemed to hesitate for a moment, until from the empty air hissed an impatient command. Then the servant pointed his wand at Bellatrix and spoke a word, and the living skeleton lying on the bed was naked, and the skeleton lying on the floor was clothed in her faded dress. The servant tore a small strip of cloth from the dress, as it lay upon the seeming corpse, and from his own robes, the fearful man then produced an empty glass flask with small traces of golden fluid clinging to its inside. This flask was concealed in a corner, the strip of skirt laid over it, the bleached cloth nearly blending with the gray metal wall. Another wave of the servant's wand floated the human skeleton lying on the bed into the air, and in almost the same motion clothed her in new black robes. An ordinary-looking bottle of chocolate milk was put into her hand, and a chill whisper ordered Bellatrix to grasp the bottle and begin drinking it, which she did, her face still looking only puzzled. Then the servant turned Bellatrix invisible, and turned himself invisible, and they left. The door closed behind them all and clicked as it locked, plunging the corridor into darkness once more, unchanged but for a small flask concealed in the corner of one cell, and a fresh corpse lying upon its floor. Earlier, in the deserted shop, Professor Quirrell had told Harry that they were going to commit the perfect crime. Harry had unthinkingly started to repeat back the standard proverb that there was no such thing as a perfect crime, before he actually thought about it for 2/3 of a second, remembered a wiser proverb, and shut his mouth in mid-sentence. What do you think you know, and how do you think you know it? If you did commit the perfect crime, nobody would ever find out, so how could anyone possibly know that there weren't perfect crimes? And as soon as you looked at it that way, you realized that perfect crimes probably got committed all the time, and the coroner marked it down as death by natural causes, or the newspaper reported that the shop had never been very profitable and had finally gone out of business. When Bellatrix Black's corpse was found dead in her cell the next morning, there within the prison of Azkaban from which, everyone knew, no one had ever escaped, nobody bothered doing an autopsy. Nobody thought twice about it. They just locked up the corridor and left, and the Daily Prophet reported it in the obituary column the next day. That was the perfect crime which Professor Quirrell had planned. And it wasn't Professor Quirrell who screwed it up. 54. The Stanford Prison Experiment, PT4. A faint green spark moved forward to set the pace, and behind it followed a brilliant silver figure, all other entities invisible. They had traversed 5 legs of corridor, turned right 5 times and gone up 5 flights of stairs, and when Bellatrix had finished her second bottle of chocolate milk, she had been given solid bars of chocolate to eat. It was after her third bar of chocolate that strange noises began to come from Bellatrix's throat. It took a moment for Harry to understand, to process the sounds. It didn't sound like anything he'd ever heard before, the rhythm of it was shattered, almost unrecognizable. It took him that long to realize that Bellatrix was crying. Bellatrix Black was crying, the Dark Lord's most terrible weapon was crying, she was invisible but you could hear it, tiny pathetic sounds she was trying to suppress, even now. It's real, said Bellatrix. Tonality had returned into her voice, no longer a dead mutter, it rose up at the end to form the question. It's real. Yes, thought the part of Harry simulating the Dark Lord, now be silent. He couldn't make those words pass his lips, he just couldn't. I knew, you would come to me, someday. Bellatrix's voice quavered and fractured as she drew breath for quiet sobs. I knew, you were alive, that you would come to me, my lord. There was a long inhalation like a huge gasp, and that even, when you came, you still wouldn't love me, never, you would never love me back, that was why, they couldn't take, my love from me, even though I can't remember so many other things, though I don't know what I forgot, but I remember how much I love you, Lord. There was a knife stabbing through Harry's heart, he'd never heard anything so terrible, he wanted to hunt down the Dark Lord and kill him just for this. Do you still, have use for me, my lord? No, hissed Harry's voice, without him even thinking, it just seemed to be operating on automatic. I entered Azkaban on a whim. Of course I have use for you. Don't ask foolish questions. But, I'm weak, said Bellatrix's voice, and a full sob escaped her, it sounded much too loud in the corridors of Azkaban. I can't kill for you, my lord, I'm sorry, they ate it all, ate me all up, I'm too weak to fight, what good am I to you now? Harry's brain cast about desperately for some way to reassure her, from the lips of a Dark Lord who would never speak a single word of caring. Ugly, said Bellatrix. Her voice said that word like it was the final nail in her coffin, the last despair. I'm ugly, they ate that too, I'm not pretty anymore, you won't even be able to use me as a reward for your servants, even the Lestranges won't want to hurt me anymore. The brilliant silver figure stopped walking. Because Harry had stopped walking. The Dark Lord, the part of Harry's self that was soft and vulnerable, was screaming in disbelieving horror, trying to reject reality, refuse the understanding, even as a colder and harder part completed the pattern. She obeyed him in that as she obeyed him in all things. The green spark bobbed urgently, darted forward. The silver humanoid stayed in place. Bellatrix was sobbing harder. I can't be useful anymore. Giant hands were squeezing Harry's chest, wringing him like a washcloth, trying to crush his heart. Please, whispered Bellatrix, just kill me. Her voice seemed to calm, once she said that. Please, Lord, kill me, I've no reason to live if I'm no use to you. I only want it to stop. Please hurt me one last time, my lord, hurt me until I stop. I love you. It was the saddest thing Harry had ever heard. The bright silver shape of Harry's Patronus flickered. Wavered. Brightened. The fury that was rising in Harry, his rage against the Dark Lord who had done this, the rage against the Dementors, against Azkaban, against the world that allowed such horror, it all seemed to be pouring straight through his arm and into his wand without there being any way of blocking it. He tried willing it to stop and nothing happened. My lord, whispered the disguised voice of Professor Quirrell. My spell is going out of control. Help me, my lord. Brighter the Patronus, brighter and brighter, it was waxing faster than on the day that Harry had destroyed a Dementor. My lord, the silhouette said in a terrified whisper. Help me. Everyone will feel it, my lord. Everyone will feel it, thought Harry. His imagination could picture it clearly, the prisoners in their cells stirring as the cold and darkness fell away, replaced by healing light. Every exposed surface now burned like a white sun in the reflections, the silhouette of Bellatrix's skeleton and the sallow man now clearly visible in the blaze, the disillusionment spells unable to keep pace with the unearthly brilliance, only the cloak of invisibility out of the deathly hallows withstood it. My lord, you must stop it. But Harry could no longer will it to stop, he no longer wanted it to stop. He could sense it, more and more of the sparks of life in Azkaban being sheltered by his Patronus, as it unfolded like spreading wings of sunlight, the air turned to absolute silver as he thought it. Harry knew what he had to do. Please, my lord. The words went unheard. They were far from him, the Dementors in their pit, but Harry knew that they could be destroyed even at this distance if the light blazed bright enough. He knew that death itself could not face him if he stopped holding back, so he unsealed all the gates inside him and sank the wells of his spell into all the deepest parts of his spirit, all his mind and all his will, and gave over absolutely everything to the spell. And in the interior of the sun, an only slightly dimmer shadow moved forward, reaching out an entreating hand. Wrong, don't. The sudden sense of doom clashed with Harry's steel determination, dread and uncertainty striving against the bright purpose. Nothing else might have reached him but that. The silhouette took another step forward and another, the sense of doom rising to a point of terrible catastrophe, and in the drench of cold water, Harry saw it. He realized the consequences of what he was doing, the danger and the trap. If you had been watching from outside, you would have seen the interior of the sun brightening and dimming. Brightening and dimming. And finally fading into ordinary moonlight that seemed like pitch darkness by contrast. Within the darkness of that moonlight stood a sallow man with his hand outstretched in entreaty, and the skeleton of a woman, lying upon the floor, a puzzled look upon her face. And Harry, still invisible, fallen to his knees. The greater danger had passed, and now Harry was just trying not to collapse, to keep the spell going at the lower level. He'd drained something, hopefully not lost something. He should have known, should have remembered, that it wasn't mere magic that fueled the Patronus charm. Thank you, my lord, whispered the sallow man. Fool, said the hard voice of a boy pretending to be a Dark Lord. Did I not warn you that the spell could prove fatal if you failed to control your emotions? Professor Quirrell's eyes did not widen, of course. Yes, my lord, I understand, said the Dark Lord's servant in a faltering voice, and turned to Bellatrix. She was already pushing herself off the floor, slowly, like an old muggle woman. How funny, Bellatrix whispered, you were almost killed by a Patronus charm. A giggle that sounded like it was blowing dust out of her giggle pipes. I could punish you, maybe, if my lord froze you in place and I had knives. Maybe I can be useful after all. Oh, I feel a little better now, how strange. Be silent, dear Bella, Harry said in a chill voice, until I give you leave to speak. There was no reply, which was obedience. The servant levitated the human skeleton, and made her invisible once more, followed shortly by his own disappearance with the sound of another cracking egg. They passed on through the corridors of Azkaban. And Harry knew that as they passed, the prisoners were stirring in their cells as the fear lifted for one precious moment, maybe even feeling a small touch of healing as his light passed them by, and then collapsing down again as the cold and darkness pressed back in. Harry was trying very hard not to think about it. Otherwise his Patronus would wax until it burned away every Dementor in Azkaban, blazing bright enough to destroy them even at this distance. Otherwise his Patronus would wax until it burned away every Dementor in Azkaban, taking all of Harry's life as fuel. In the Auror's quarters at the top of Azkaban, one Auror trio was snoring in the barracks, one Auror trio was resting in the break room, and one Auror trio was on duty in the command room, keeping their watch. The command room was simple but large, with 3 chairs at back where 3 Aurors sat, their wands always in hand to sustain their 3 Patronuses, as the bright white forms paced in front of the open window, sheltering them all from the Dementor's fear. The 3 of them usually stuck to the back, and played poker, and didn't look out the window. You could have seen some sky there, sure, and there was even an hour or 2 every day where you could have seen some sun, but that window also looked down on the central pit of hell. Just in case a Dementor wanted to float up and talk to you. There was no way that Auror Li would have agreed to serve duty here, triple pay or no triple pay, if he hadn't had a family to support. His real name was Xiao Guang, and everyone called him Mike instead. He'd named his children Su and Cao, which hopefully would serve them better. His only consolation, besides the money, was that at least his mates played an excellent game of dragon poker. Though it would be hard not to, at this point. It was their 5,366th game and Li had what would probably be his best hand of the 5,300s. It was a Saturday in February and there were 3 players, which let him shift the suit of any one whole card except a 2, 3, or 7, and that was enough to let him build a core with unicorns, dragons, and 7s. Across the table from him, Gerard McCusker looked up from the table cards toward the direction of the window, staring. The sinking feeling came over Lee's stomach with surprising speed. If his 7 of hearts got hit by a Dementor modifier and turned into a 6, he was going straight down to 2 pair and McCusker might beat that. Mike, said McCusker, what's with your Patronus? Li turned his head and looked. His soft silver badger had turned away from its watch over the pit and was staring downward at something only it could see. A moment later, Barry's moonlit duck and McCusker's bright anteater followed suit, staring in the same downward direction. They all exchanged glances, and then sighed. I'll tell them, said Barry. Protocol called for sending the 3 Aurors who were off duty but not sleeping to investigate anything anomalous. Maybe relieve one of them and take the C spiral, if you two don't mind. Li exchanged a glance with McCusker, and they both nodded. It wasn't too hard to break into Azkaban, if you were wealthy enough to hire a powerful wizard, and well-intentioned enough to recruit someone who could cast the Patronus charm. People with friends in Azkaban would do that break in just to give someone a half-day's worth of Patronus time, a chance at some real dreams instead of nightmares. Leave them a supply of chocolate to conceal in their cell, to increase the chance they lived through their sentence. And the Aurors on guard. Well, even if you got caught, you could probably convince the Aurors to overlook it, in exchange for the right bribe. For Li, the right bribe tended to be in the range of 2 nuts and a silver sickle. He hated this place. But Barry one hand had a wife and the wife had healer's bills, and if you could afford to hire someone who could break into Azkaban, then you could afford to grease Barry's remaining palm pretty hard, if he was the one who caught you. By unspoken agreement, none of them giving anything away by being the first to propose it, the 3 of them finished out their poker hand first. Li won, since no Dementors had actually shown up. And by then the Patronuses had stopped staring and gone back to their normal patrol, so it was probably nothing, but procedure was procedure. After Li raked in the pot, Barry gave them all formal nods, and stood up from the table. The older man's long white locks brushed against his fancy red robes, his robes brushed the metal floor of the command room, as Barry went through the separating door that led to the formerly off-duty Aurors. Li had been sorted into Hufflepuff, and he sometimes felt a little queasy about this kind of business. But Barry had shown them all the pictures, and you had to let a man do what he could for his poor sick wife, especially when he only had 7 months left before his retirement. The faint green spark floated through the metal corridors, and the silver humanoid, seeming a little dimmer now, followed after it. Sometimes the bright figure would flare, especially when they passed one of the huge metal doors, but it always died back down again. Mere eyes could not have seen the invisible others, the 11-year-old boy who lived, and the living skeleton that was Bellatrix Black, and the Polyjuice defense professor of Hogwarts, all traveling together through Azkaban. If that was the beginning of a joke, Harry didn't know the punchline. They'd gone up another 4 flights of stairs before the rough voice of the defense professor said, simply and without emphasis, "Auror coming." It took too long, a whole second maybe, for Harry to understand, for the jolt of adrenaline to pump into his blood, and for him to remember what Professor Quirrell had already discussed with him and told him to do in this case, and then Harry spun on his heel and flew back the way they'd come. Harry reached the flight of stairs, and frantically laid himself down on the 3rd step from the top, the cold metal feeling hard even through his cloak and robes. Trying to move his head up to peer over the lip of the stairs showed that he couldn't see Professor Quirrell, and that meant that Harry was out of the line of any stray fire. His shining Patronus followed after him, and lay down beside him on the step just beneath him, for it too must not be seen. There was a faint sound as of wind or whooshing, and then the sound of Bellatrix's invisible body coming to rest on a stair further below. She had no place in this except. Stay still, said the cold high whisper, stay silent. There was stillness, and silence. Harry pressed his wand against the side of the metal step just above him. If he was anyone else, he would have needed to take a canute out of his pocket. Or rip off a bit of cloth from his robe. Or bite off one of his nails. Or find a speck of rock large enough that he could see it and solid enough to stay in one place and orientation while it touched his wand. But with Harry's almighty power of partial transfiguration, this was not necessary. He could skip that particular step of the operation and use any material near to hand. 30 seconds later, Harry was the proud new owner of a curved mirror, and Wingardium Leviosa, Harry whispered as quietly as he could. Dot was levitating it just above the steps, and watching, in that curved surface, almost the whole corridor where Professor Quirrell invisibly waited. Harry heard it in the distance, then, the sound of footsteps. And saw the form, a little hard to see in the mirror, of a person in red robes, coming down the stairs, entering the seemingly empty corridor, accompanied by a small Patronus animal that Harry couldn't quite make out. The aura was protected by a blue shimmer. It was hard to see the details, but Harry could see that much. The aura had shields already raised and strengthened. Crap, thought Harry. According to the defense professor, the essential art of dueling consisted of trying to put up defenses that would block whatever someone was likely to throw at you, while trying in turn to attack in ways that were likely to go past their current set of defenses. And by far the easiest way to win any sort of real fight, Professor Quirrell had said this over and over, was to shoot the enemy before they raised a shield in the first place, either from behind or from close enough range that they couldn't dodge or counter in time. Though Professor Quirrell might still be able to get in a shot from behind, if. But the aura halted after taking 3 steps into the corridor. Nice disillusionment, said a hard male voice that Harry didn't recognize. Now show yourself, or you'll be in real trouble. The form of the sallow, bearded man became visible then. And you with the Patronus, said the hard voice. Come out too. Now. Wouldn't be smart, said the gravelly voice of the sallow man. It was no longer the terrified voice of the Dark Lord's servant, it had suddenly become the professional intimidation of a competent criminal. You don't want to see who's behind me. Trust me, you don't. 500 galleons, cold cash up front, if you turn around and walk away. Big trouble for your career if you don't. There was a long pause. Look, whoever you are, said the hard voice. You seem confused about how this works. I don't care if that's Lucius Malfoy behind you or Albus Bloody Dumbledore. You all come out, I scan the whole lot of you, and then we talk about how much this is going to cost you. 2,000 galleons, final offer, said the gravelly voice, taking on a warning undertone. That's 10 times the going rate and more than you make in a year. And believe me, if you see something you shouldn't, you're going to regret not taking that. Shut it, said the hard voice. You've got exactly 5 seconds to drop that wand before I drop you. 5-4. What are you doing, Professor Quirrell? Harry thought frantically. Attack first. Cast a shield at least. 3, 2, 1. Stupefy. Barry stared, a chill running down his spine. The man's wand had moved so fast that it was like it had apparated into place, and Barry's stunner was currently sparkling tamely at the end of it, not blocked, not countered, not deflected, caught like a fly in honey. My offer has gone back down to 500 galleons, said the man in a colder, more formal voice. He smiled dryly, and the smile looked wrong on that bearded face. And you shall need to accept a memory charm. Barry had already swapped the harmonics on his shields so that his own stunner couldn't pass back through, already tilted his wand back into a defensive position, already raised his hardened artificial hand into position to block anything blockable, and was already thinking wordless spells to put more layers on his shields. The man wasn't looking at Barry. Instead, he was poking curiously at Barry's stunner where it still wavered on the end of his wand, drawing out red sparks and flicking them away with his fingers, slowly disassembling the hex like a child's rod puzzle. The man hadn't raised any shields of his own. Tell me, the man said in a disinterested voice that didn't seem to quite fit the rough throat polyjuice Barry would have called it, if he'd thought that anyone could possibly do magic that delicate from inside someone else's body. What did you do in the last war? Put yourself in harm's way, or stay out of trouble. Harm's way, said Barry. His voice kept the iron calm of an Auror with nearly 100 full years on the force, 7 months short of mandatory retirement. Mad-Eye Moody couldn't have said it with any more hardness. Fight any Death Eaters. Now a grim smile graced Barry's own face. 2 at once. 2 of you know whose own warrior assassins, personally trained by their dark master. 2 Death Eaters at once against Barry alone. It had been the toughest fight of Barry's life, but he'd stood his ground, and walked away with only the loss of his left hand. Did you kill them? The man sounded idly curious, and he continued to draw threads of fire out of the much diminished stunbolt still captive on the end of his wand, his fingers now weaving small patterns of Bari's own magic before flicking to disperse them. Sweat broke out on Bari's skin beneath his robes. His metal hand flashed downward, ripped the mirror from his belt. Bari to Mike, I need backup. There was a pause, and silence. Bari to Mike. The mirror lay dull and lifeless in his hand. Slowly, Bari put it back on his belt. It's been quite a while since I had a serious fight with a serious opponent, the man said, still not looking up at Bari. Try not to disappoint me too much. You can attack whenever you're ready. Or you can walk away with 500 galleons. There was a long silence. Then the air screamed like metal cutting glass as Bari slashed his wand downward. Harry could hardly see it, could hardly make out anything amid the lights and flashes. His mirror's curve was perfect. They'd practiced that tactic before in the Chaos Legion, but the scene was still too small, and Harry had the feeling he wouldn't be able to understand even if he was watching from a meter away. It was all happening too fast, red blasts deflecting from blue shields, green bars of light clashing together, shadowy forms appearing and vanishing. He couldn't even tell who was casting what. Except that the Auror was shouting incantation after incantation and frantically dodging while Professor Quirrell's polyjuiced form stood in one place and flicked his wand, mostly silently, but now and then pronouncing words in unrecognizable languages that would white out the whole mirror and show half the Auror's shielding torn away as he staggered back. Harry had seen exhibition duels between the strongest 7th-year students, and this was so far above it that Harry's mind felt numbed, looking at how far he had left to go. There wasn't a single 7th-year student who could have lasted half a minute against the Auror. All 3 7th-year armies put together might not be able to scratch the defense professor. The Auror had fallen to the ground, one knee and one hand supporting himself as the other hand gestured frantically and his mouth shouted desperate words. The few incantations that Harry recognized were all shield spells, as a flock of shadows spun around the Auror like a whirlwind of razors. And Harry saw Professor Quirrell's polyjuiced form deliberately point his wand at where the Auror kneeled and fought the last moments of his battle. Surrender, said the gravelly voice. The Auror spat something unspeakable. In that case, said the voice, Avada. Time seemed to move very slowly, like there was time to hear the individual syllables, K, and Da, and Vera, time to watch the Auror starting to throw himself desperately aside, and even though it was all happening so slowly, somehow there wasn't time to do anything, no time for Harry to open his lips and scream no, no time to move, maybe even not any time to think. Only time for one desperate wish that an innocent man should not die. And a blazing silver figure stood before the Auror. Stood there just a fraction of a second before the green light struck home. Bari was twisting frantically aside, not knowing if he was going to make it. His eyes were focused on his opponent and his onrushing death, so Bari only briefly saw the outline of the brilliant silhouette, the Patronus brighter than any he'd ever seen, saw it just barely long enough to recognize the impossible shape, before the green and the silver light collided and both lights vanished, the killing curse had been blocked, and then Bari's ears were pierced as he saw his terrible opponent screaming, clutching at his head and screaming. Starting to fall as Bari was already falling. Bari hit the ground, falling from his own frantic lunge, and his dislocated left shoulder and broken rib screamed in protest. Bari ignored the pain, managed to scramble back to his knees, brought up his wand to stun his opponent. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew that this was his only chance. Stupefy. The red bolt struck out toward the man's falling body, and was torn apart in midair and dissipated, and not by any shield. Bari could see it, the wavering in the air that surrounded his fallen and screaming opponent. Bari could feel it like a deadly pressure on his skin, the flux of magic building and building and building towards some terrible breaking point. His instincts screamed at him to run before the explosion came. This was no charm, no curse, this was wizardry run wild, but before Bari could even finish getting to his feet, the man threw his wand away from himself, he threw away his wand. And a second later, his form blurred and vanished entirely. A green snake lay motionless on the ground, unmoving even before Bari's next stunner spell, fired in sheer reflex, hit it without resistance. As the dreadful flux and pressure began to dissipate, as the wild wizardry died back down, Bari's dazed mind noticed that the scream was continuing. Only it sounded different, like the scream of a young boy, coming from the stairs leading down to the next lower level. That scream choked off too, and then there was silence except for Bari's frantic panting. His thoughts were slow, confused, disarrayed. His opponent had been insanely powerful, that hadn't been a duel, it had been like his first year as a trainee or trying to fight Madame Tarma. The Death Eaters hadn't been a tenth that good, Mad-Eye Moody wasn't that good. And who, what, how in the name of Merlin's balls had anyone blocked a killing curse? Bari managed to summon the energy to press his wand against his rib, mutter the healing spell, and then press it again to his shoulder. It took more out of him than it should have, took far too much out of him. His magic was within a bare breath of utter exhaustion. He didn't have anything left for his minor cuts and bruises or even to reinforce the scraps left of his shielding. It was all he could do not to let his Patronus go out. Barry breathed deeply, heavily, steadied his breath as much as he could before he spoke. You, Barry said, whoever you are, come out. There was silence, and it occurred to Barry that whoever it was might be unconscious. He didn't understand what had just happened, but he'd heard the scream. Well, there was one way to test that. Come out, said Barry, making his voice harder, or I start using area effect curses. He probably couldn't have managed one if he'd tried. Wait, said a boy's voice, a young boy's voice, high and thin and wavering, like someone was holding back exhaustion or tears. The voice now seemed to be coming from closer to hand. Please wait. I'm coming out. Drop the invisibility, growled Barry. He was too tired to bother with anti-disillusionment charms. A moment later, a young boy's face emerged from within an unfolding invisibility cloak, and Barry saw the black hair, the green eyes, the glasses, and the angry red lightning bolt scar. If he'd had 20 fewer years of experience under his belt, he might have blinked. Instead, he just spat something that he probably shouldn't ought to say in front of the boy who lived. The boy's wavering voice said. His young face looked frightened and exhausted, and tears were still trickling down his cheeks. He kidnapped me, to make me cast my Patronus. He said he'd kill me if I didn't. Only I couldn't let him just kill you. Barry's mind was still dazed, but things were slowly starting to click into place. Harry Potter, the only wizard ever to survive a killing curse. Barry might have been able to dodge the Green Death, he'd certainly been trying, but if the matter came up before the Wizengamot, they'd rule it was a life debt to a noble house. I see, Barry said in a much gentler growl. He started to walk toward the boy. Son, I'm sorry for what you've been through, but I need you to drop the cloak and drop your wand. The rest of Harry Potter emerged from invisibility, showing the sweat-soaked blue-trimmed Hogwarts robes, and his right hand clutching an 11-inch holly wand so hard his knuckles were white. Your wand, Barry repeated. Sorry, whispered the 11-year-old boy, here, and he held out the wand toward Barry. Barry barely stopped himself from snarling at the traumatized boy who'd just saved his life. Instead, he overrode the impulse with a sigh, and just stretched out a hand to take the wand. Look, son, you're really not supposed to point a wand at. The wand's end twisted lightly beneath Barry's hand just as the boy whispered, Somnium. Harry stared at the Auror's crumpled body. There was no sense of triumph, just a crushing sense of despair. Even then it might not have been too late. Harry turned to look at where the green snake lay motionless. Teacher, hissed Harry. Friend, please, are you alive? An awful fear was taking hold in Harry's heart. In that moment he had entirely forgotten that he'd just seen the defense professor try to kill a police officer. Harry pointed his wand at the snake, and his lips even began to shape the word enervate before his brain caught up with him and screamed at him. He didn't dare use magic on Professor Quirrell. Harry had felt it, the burning, tearing pain in his head, like his brain was about to split in half. He'd felt it, his magic and Professor Quirrell's magic, matched and anti-harmonized in a fulfillment of doom. That was the mysterious, terrible thing that would happen if Harry and Professor Quirrell ever got too close to each other, or if they ever cast magic on each other, or if their spells ever touched, their magic would resonate out of control. Harry stared at the snake. He couldn't tell if it was breathing. The last seconds ticked away. He turned to stare at the Auror, who had seen the boy who lived, who knew. The full magnitude of the disaster crushed in on Harry like 1,000 100-ton weights. He'd managed to stun the Auror, but now there was nothing left to do, no way to recover. The mission had failed, everything had failed, he had failed. Shocked, dismayed, despairing, he didn't think of it, didn't see the obvious, didn't remember where the hopeless feelings were coming from, didn't realize that he still needed to recast the true Patronus charm. And then it was already too late. Auror Li and Auror McCusker had rearranged their chairs around the table, and so they both saw it at the same time, the naked, skeletally thin horror rising up to hover outside the window, the headache already hitting them from seeing it. They both heard the voice, like a long-dead corpse had spoken words, and those words themselves had aged and died. The Dementor's speech hurt their ears as it said, Bellatrix Black is out of her cell. There was a split second of horrified silence, and then Li tore out of his chair, heading for the communicator to call in reinforcements from the ministry, even as McCusker grabbed his mirror and started frantically trying to raise the 3 Aurors who'd gone on patrol. 55. The Stanford Prison Experiment, PT-5. In a scarred and ruined corridor, lit by dim gas lights, a boy slowly crept forward, one hand stretched out toward the unmoving snake that was the body of his teacher. Harry was only a meter away from the snake's body when he first felt it tickling at the edge of his perception. Ever so weakly, a sense of doom. Professor Quirrell was alive, then. The thought engendered no feeling of joy, only a sort of empty despair. Harry would still be caught soon, and no matter how he tried to explain, it still wouldn't look good. No one would trust him again. They would think he was the next Dark Lord. They wouldn't help him when it came time to fight Lord Voldemort. Hermione would give up on him. Probably even Dumbledore would look for another hero. Maybe they'd just send him home to his parents. He had failed. Harry looked at the crumpled body of the police officer he'd stunned, the already drying blood from the minor cuts and slashes, the burned places on the intricately embroidered red robes. He'd been stupid. He shouldn't have stunned the police officer, should have just stayed with his original story about being kidnapped by Professor Quirrell. It might not be too late, whispered a voice inside him. You might still be able to fix your mistake. The Auror saw you, he remembers that you stunned him. But if he were dead, if Professor Quirrell were dead, if Bellatrix were dead, there would be no one to contradict your story. Slowly, Harry's hand started to rise, pointing his wand at the police officer and Harry's hand halted. He had a distant sense he was behaving uncharacteristically of himself, somehow. Like there was something he'd forgotten, something important, but he was having trouble remembering what it was, exactly. Oh, that was right. He was someone who believed in the value of human life. A sense of puzzlement accompanied the thought, he couldn't quite remember why other people's lives had seemed valuable. All right, said the logical part of him, why has my mind changed between then and now? Because he was in Azkaban. And he'd forgotten to recast the Patronus charm. Doing anything at all, somehow, seemed like a tremendous effort, like the thought of action itself was a weight too heavy to lift, but it did seem like a good idea to recast the Patronus charm, for he was still able to be afraid of Dementors. And though he couldn't remember what it was like to be happy, he knew that this wasn't it. Harry's hand rose to hold his wand level before him, his fingers took the starting positions. And then Harry paused. He couldn't quite remember what he'd used as his happy thought. That was odd, it had been something very important, he really ought to be able to remember it. Something to do with death. But that wasn't happy. His body was shivering, Azkaban hadn't seemed so cold before, and it seemed to be getting colder even as he thought. It was too late for him, he'd already sunk too far, he'd never be able to cast the Patronus charm now. That may be the dementation talking rather than an accurate estimate, observed the logical part of himself, habits that had been encoded into sheer reflex, requiring no energy to activate. Think of the Dementor's fear as a cognitive bias, and try to overcome it the way you would overcome any other cognitive bias. Your hopeless feelings may not indicate that the situation is actually hopeless. It may only indicate that you are in the presence of Dementors. All negative emotions and pessimistic estimates must now be considered suspect, fallacious until proven valid. If you'd been watching the boy as he thought, you would have seen a distant, abstract, puzzled frown move across his face, below the glasses and the lightning bolt scar. His hand stayed in the starting position for the Patronus charm, and did not move. The presence of Dementors interferes with the part of you that processes happiness. If you cannot retrieve your happy thought by mnemonic association on the key of happiness, perhaps you can get at the memory some other way instead. When was the last time you talked to someone about the Patronus charm? Harry couldn't seem to remember that either. A crushing wave of despair swept over him, and was dismissed by the logical part of himself as untrustworthy, external, not Harry. The dull weight still pressed him down, but his mind went on thinking. It didn't take much effort to think. When was the last time you talked to someone about Dementors? Professor Quirrell had said that he was already able to feel the presence of Dementors, and Harry had said to Professor Quirrell. He'd told Professor Quirrell to hold to the memory of the stars, of falling bodilessly through space, like an occlumency barrier across his entire mind. His second defense class of the year, on Friday, that was when Professor Quirrell had shown him the stars, and again on Christmas. It didn't take much effort to remember them, the searing points of white against perfect blackness. Harry remembered the great cloudy wash of the Milky Way. Harry remembered the peace. Some of the coldness at the fringes of his limbs seemed to retreat. There were words he had spoken out loud on the day he'd first cast the Patronus charm, his mind could remember the sounds in the speech even as the feelings seemed distant. I thought of my absolute rejection of death as the natural order. You cast the true Patronus charm by thinking about the value of human life. ... But there are other lives that are still alive to be fought for. Your life, and my life, and Hermione Granger's life, all the lives of Earth, and all the lives beyond, to be defended and protected. Then the idea of killing everyone. That hadn't been his true self, that had been the dementation talking. Despair was the Dementor's influence. Where there's life, there's hope. The Auror is still alive. Professor Quirrell is still alive. Bellatrix is still alive. I'm still alive. No one's actually died yet. Harry could picture the Earth, now, in the midst of the starfield, the blue-white orb. And I won't let them. Expecto Patronum. The words came out a little halting, and when the human shape burst back into existence it was dim at first, moonlight instead of sunlight, white instead of silver. But it strengthened, slowly, as Harry breathed in deliberate rhythm, recovering. Letting the light drive back the darkness from his mind. Remembering the things that he had almost forgotten, and channeling them back into the Patronus charm. Even when the light blazed full and silver once more, illuminating the corridor more brightly than the gas lamps, banishing fully the cold, Harry's limbs still shook. That had been too close. Harry took a deep breath. All right. It was time to reconsider the situation now that his thoughts were no longer being artificially darkened by dementors. Harry reviewed the situation. Still looked pretty hopeless, actually. It wasn't the crushing despair of before, but Harry still felt wobbly, to put it mildly. He didn't dare go dark, and it was his dark side that had the ability to take this level of problem in stride. It was his dark side that would have laughed scornfully at the very concept of giving up just because he'd lost Professor Quirrell and was marooned in the depths of Azkaban and had been seen by a police officer. The ordinary Harry was not able to take that sort of thing in stride. But there wasn't any option except to keep moving forward anyway. You couldn't get any more pointless than giving up before you'd actually lost. Harry looked around. Dim gas lights lit a corridor of gray metal, whose sides and floor and ceiling were slashed in places, gouged and melted, telling anyone who cared to look that there had been battle here. Professor Quirrell could have repaired it easily enough, if he'd. The sense of betrayal struck Harry with full force, then. Why? Why did he? Why? Because he's evil, said Gryffindor and Hufflepuff quietly and sadly. We told you so. No, thought Harry desperately. No, it doesn't make sense. We were going to commit the perfect crime. The aura could have been obliterated, the corridor repaired. It wasn't too late, but it would have been too late if he died. But Professor Quirrell was never really planning to commit the perfect crime, said the grim voice of Slytherin. He wanted the crime to be noticed. He wanted everyone to know that someone had killed an Auror and broken Bellatrix Black out of Azkaban. He would have prepared some kind of evidence, some proof he could reveal of your involvement, to use as blackmail against you, and you would have been bound to him forever. Harry's Patronus almost went out then. No, Harry thought. Yes, said the other three parts of him sadly. No, it still doesn't make sense. Professor Quirrell had to know I would turn against him the instant I saw him kill an Auror. That I might very well go ahead and confess to Dumbledore, hoping to plead the true fact that I was tricked. And, in terms of blackmail, does his killing an Auror against my will really add all that much to breaking Bellatrix out of Azkaban with my willing help? It would have been more cunning to keep the evidence of my involvement with the basic crime, but still pretend to be my ally for as long as he could, saving the blackmail to use only if it became necessary. Rationalization, said Slytherin. So why did Professor Quirrell do it then? And Harry thought with a tinge of desperation, knowing, even as he thought it, that he was motivated in part by a desire to reject reality, and that wasn't how the technique was meant to be wielded. I notice that I am confused. There was internal silence. None of the parts of himself seemed to have anything to add to that. And Harry continued to take stock of the moderately hopeless-looking situation. Did Harry need to re-evaluate the probability that Bellatrix was evil? Not in any mission-relevant sense. It was a given that Bellatrix was currently evil. Whether she was an innocent who'd been made that way by torture and legilimency and unspeakable rituals, or whether she'd chosen it of her own will, didn't have much bearing on the current situation. The key fact was that while Bellatrix thought Harry was the Dark Lord, she would obey him. That was one resource, then. But Bellatrix was starved and 9/10 dead. Oh, I feel a little better now, how strange. Bellatrix had said that, in her shattered voice, after Harry's Patronus had blazed out of control. Harry thought, and he couldn't have quite said why he thought this, it might have just been his own mind making things up, but it seemed likely that what the Dementors had taken from you long ago was lost forever. But what the Dementors had taken from you recently, the true Patronus charm might give back. Like the difference between emptying a cup, and the unused cup fading away. Bellatrix, then, might have got back what she'd lost in just the last week or so. Not any happy memories, those would have been eaten years ago. But whatever strength and magic had been drained from her in just the last week, she might have regained. Like the equivalent of getting a week of rest, a week to build up her magic again. Harry looked at Professor Quirrell's snake form. Maybe enough for an enervate. If awakening Professor Quirrell was, in fact, a smart thing to do. Some of the despair came back to Harry, then. He couldn't trust Professor Quirrell, couldn't trust that reviving him would be wise, not after what had just happened. Steady, Harry thought to himself, and looked at the crumpled form of the Auror. Bellatrix might also be able to manage a memory charm. That could be step one, anyway. It wasn't exactly getting everyone safely out of Azkaban, and the Aurors would know afterward that something strange had happened. They might suspect Bellatrix's body and perform an autopsy. But it was a step. And would it be all that hard to get out of Azkaban? If they could get to the top of Azkaban quickly enough, before the Auror was supposed to report back in, before anyone noticed him missing, then they could just fly out through the hole Professor Quirrell had made, and get far enough away from Azkaban to activate the portkey Harry already had in his possession. Both Professor Quirrell and Harry had portkeys, and both were powerful enough to transport 2 humans, plus or minus a snake. As with their doubly concealed departure from Mary's room, Professor Quirrell had put enough safety margin in his plans to impress even Harry. Bellatrix could carry Professor Quirrell's snake form, which Harry dared not touch or levitate. Harry turned and strode quickly toward where Bellatrix was waiting on the stairs. He could feel his spirits reviving a little. It was starting to look like a good plan, and there was no time to waste in going about it. What to do with Professor Quirrell, or for that matter Bellatrix, after the portkey took them to where they were supposed to hand Bellatrix over to the psychiatric healer? Well, Harry could work that out along the way. Harry would probably have to bamboozle the healer into doing something, which was going to take one hell of a bamboozling, and Harry wasn't even sure what he wanted done, but he and Bellatrix had to get moving now. The main problem Harry saw, as he quickly ran the whole process forward in his imagination, would come when they reached the roof. Professor Quirrell had been supposed to sneak around invisibly and confund the monitors that would notice visitors in the aerial surroundings of Azkaban, causing them to see a repeating loop of scenery for a few minutes. Professor Quirrell had said that he couldn't disillusion Harry's Patronus, and if they switched off the Patronus, the Dementors would notice Bellatrix was missing, and alert the Aurors. Harry's train of thought stumbled. There were times when, "Aw crap," just didn't seem to cover it. Lee's hands were sure despite the adrenaline, as he unlocked the bars on the vanishing cabinet that linked Azkaban to a well-guarded room in the interior of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. A one-way vanishing cabinet, of course. The wards permitted a few fast ways into Azkaban, all of them highly restricted, and no fast ways out. Li stepped well back, pointed his wand at the cabinet, spoke the incantation, Harmonia Nectar Passus, and not a second later, the door of the cabinet burst open with a bang, and into the room strode a heavy-set, square-jawed witch with great hair cropped close around her head. She wore no rank signs as she wore no jewelry or other ornamentation, it was only in ordinary Auror's robes that she deemed fit to grace herself. Director Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and said to be the only witch in the DMLE who could take Mad-Eye Moody in a fair fight, not that either of those two were the sort to fight fairly. Li had heard rumors that Amelia could operate within the bounds of the DMLE, and this was the sort of thing that gave rise to rumors like that. He'd called in the alarm not 50 seconds ago. "Get into the air, now." Amelia barked over her shoulder at the female Auror trio following behind her with police broomsticks. They must have all been crushed in there, waiting for Li to activate the cabinet. "I want more aerial coverage on this place. And make sure you keep up your anti-disillusionment charms." Then her head turned toward him. "Report, Auror Li. Do we know how they got in yet?" Another Auror trio holding broomsticks materialized in the vanishing cabinet and strode out after them even as Li began talking. They were followed by a trio of hit wizards in full battle gear. Then another trio of hit wizards. Then another broomstick team. The emaciated form that was Bellatrix Black was resting motionless on the stairs when Harry got there, eyes closed, and when Harry asked in a cold, high whisper whether she was awake, he got no response. A brief twitch of panic was countered by the thought that Professor Quirrell had knocked her out to prevent her from hearing the Dark Lord's cringing servant suddenly turn into a hardened criminal and then an expert battle mage. Which was good, because she wouldn't have heard Harry's voice saying, "Expecto Patronum." Harry drew back the hood of the cloak, pointed his wand at Bellatrix, and whispered as gently as he could, "Enervate." From the way Bellatrix's body jerked a little, Harry didn't think he'd manage to get it quite gentle enough. The sunken dark eyes opened. "Bella dear," Harry said in his cold, high voice, "I am afraid we've run into a bit of a problem. Have you recovered enough to do small magics?" There was a pause, and then Bellatrix's pale head nodded. "Very good," Harry said dryly. "I won't ask you to walk unaided, Bella dear, but I am afraid you must walk." He pointed his wand at her. "Wingardium Leviosa." Harry kept the flow of force down to something he could sustain for a while, and it was still probably lifting 2/3 of her current body weight. She was thin. Slowly, as though for the first time in years, Bellatrix Black pushed herself to her feet. Amelia strode into the duty room, Auror Li and his silver badger following behind her. She'd spun her time turner the moment she'd heard the alarm, and then spent a tense hour preparing her forces for entry. You couldn't loop time within Azkaban itself, Azkaban's future couldn't interact with its past, so she hadn't been able to arrive before the DMLE had gotten the message, but she should have arrived in time. Her eyes went straight to the corpse, uncloaked and looking very dead, floating beyond the viewing window. "Where is Bellatrix Black?" Amelia demanded, showing no fear before the creature of fear. Even her own blood froze for an instant, as the corpse parted its lips, and gurgled, "Do not know." Harry watched, now fully invisible once more, as Bellatrix slowly leaned down, took Professor Quirrell's wand, which Harry dared not touch, and slowly straightened again. Then Bellatrix pointed the wand at the snake, and said, her voice precise though it was still a whisper, "Enervate." The snake did not stir. "Shall I try again, my lord?" she whispered. "No," Harry said. He swallowed the sick feeling. Harry had decided to say the hell with it and try to revive Professor Quirrell after he'd realized that the Dementors had probably alerted the Aurors by now. His high, cold voice went on, unperturbed, "Do you think you are able to perform a memory charm, dear Bella?" Bellatrix paused, and then said, hesitantly, "I think so, my lord." "Eliminate that Auror's last half hour of memory," Harry commanded. He'd thought a bit about whether he wanted to provide any justification for that, what he would say if Bellatrix asked why they weren't just killing him, in which case Harry would explain that they were pretending to be a different power group and then tell her to shut up. But Bellatrix simply pointed her wand at the Auror, stood silently for a time, and finally whispered, "Obliviate." She swayed, then, but did not fall. "Very good, my dear Bella," Harry said, and chuckled thinly. "And I will ask you to carry that snake." Again, the woman said nothing, demanded no explanations, didn't ask why Harry or the apparently invisible Patronus caster couldn't do it. She only staggered to where the long snake lay, slowly bent over, picked it up, draped it over her shoulder. A tiny little part of Harry observed that it was very relaxing to have a minion that would just follow orders so unquestioningly, and even got as far as thinking that he could totally get used to having a minion like Bellatrix before that mind fraction was screamed into silence by his mortally offended remainder. "Follow," the boy commanded his minion, and began to walk. It was starting to get crowded in the duty room, almost too crowded to breathe, though there was still space around Amelia herself. If needing to breathe meant that you had to crowd Director Bones, it was better not to breathe. Amelia looked at where Aura was fiddling with Aura McCusker's mirror. "Specialist Weinbach," she barked, causing the young witch to start. Any response from One Hand's mirror? None, Aura said nervously. I mean, it has to be jammed, not dead, carefully jammed because it didn't set off the alarms, but the line is so blank the mirror might as well be broken. Amelia didn't let her expression change, though the part of her that was already mourning One Hand got a little sadder and a lot more angry. 7 months, he'd had 7 months left until his retirement after a full century of service. She remembered him as an eager young Auror, so very long ago, and his whole career he'd served the DMLE with perfect loyalty, at least when it came to anything really important. Someone would burn for this. The Dementor still hovered outside the window, casting its useless shadow of dread over their operations. All the creature could do was gurgle its lack of knowledge or fail to reply at all, when asked questions like, "Did Bellatrix Black escape?" And, "Why can't you find her?" And, "How is she being hidden?" Amelia was starting to worry that the criminals were already gone, when "We found a hole in the roof over C Spiral," someone shouted from the doorway. "Still open, ward circumvention still active." Amelia's lips peeled back in a smile like a wolf opening its jaws to eat. Bellatrix Black was still in Azkaban. And in Azkaban, Bellatrix Black would remain forever. She took a stride toward the window, ignoring the Dementor now, and looked up at the sky above, to check with her own eyes the patrolling broomsticks. She couldn't see the whole sky from here, but she saw 10 brooms go past on a patrol pattern, and that already ought to be enough to catch anyone, though she fully meant to put every broom she could in the air. Her Aurors were equipped with the fastest racing broom currently on the market, the Nimbus 2000, no unsuccessful chases for her people. Amelia turned back from the window, and frowned. The room was getting ridiculously crowded, and 2/3 of these people didn't need to be here, they just wanted to be close to the center of the action. If there was one thing Amelia couldn't tolerate, it was people who did what they wanted instead of what was needed. "All right, you lot." Amelia bellowed at them. "Stop hanging around here and start securing the top level of each spiral." "That's right," she said to the looks of surprise, all 3. They could tunnel through a floor or a ceiling to go between them, in case you hadn't worked it out. "We're going down level by level until we catch them. I'll take C Spiral, Scrimgore, you're on B." She paused, then, remembering that Mad Eye had retired last year, who could she? "Shacklebolt, you're on the A Spiral, take with the strongest other fighters. Check every set of cells you pass, look under blankets, do the full set of detection charms in every corridor. Nobody leaves Azkaban until the criminals are caught, nobody." And people looked at Amelia in surprise as her voice trailed off. The criminals had invented some way to prevent the Dementors from finding Bellatrix Black. That ought to have been impossible. It chilled her blood, contemplating that. It was like. Amelia took a deep breath, and spoke once more, in a voice of steel command. "And when you catch them, make bloody sure they're the real criminals and not our own people forced to take polyjuice. Anyone behaves oddly, check them for the Imperious Curse. Keep each other in sight at all times. Don't assume an Auror uniform is friendly if you don't recognize the face." She turned to the communication specialist. "Tell the broomsticks. If one of the brooms peels off for no reason, half of them are to hunt it down while the rest keep patrolling. And change the harmonics on everything changeable, they may have stolen our keys." Then back to the rest of the room. "No Auror is above suspicion unless they have no family left to threaten." She saw it, the cold looks that came over the older faces, saw some of the younger Aurors flinch, and knew that they understood. But she said it out loud, just to be sure. "We're fighting the old wizarding war today, everyone. Just because you know who is dead doesn't mean the Death Eaters have forgotten his tricks. Now go." Harry walked in silence through the gas-lit gray corridor, invisible beside Bellatrix and the silver shape following them, trying to think of a better plan. At first, when he'd realized that the Aurors probably knew already, and that moreover, Professor Quirrell wasn't waking up. His thoughts had frozen up there, for a second. and then stayed frozen, even as he'd gotten himself and Bellatrix heading downward, to buy as much time as possible. The Aurors, Harry figured, would start at the top and move down level by level. The Aurors could afford to move slowly and securely, they knew their prey had no way out. Harry hadn't been able to think of any way out. Until Harry had said to himself, well, if it was just a war game, what would General Chaos do? From which an answer had followed instantly. And then Harry had thought, but if it's that easy, why hasn't anyone broken out of Azkaban before? And after he'd realized the possible problem, fine, what would General Chaos do about that? Whereupon General Chaos had come up with an amendment to his first plan. It was the most insanely Gryffindor thing Harry had ever. So now he was trying to think of a better plan, and not having much luck. Picky, said Gryffindor, who was complaining about not having any plan 1 minute earlier. You should be glad we came up with anything at all, Mr. Now we're doomed. My lord, Bellatrix whispered haltingly, as she navigated the next flight of stairs downward, am I going back to my cell, my lord? Harry's brain was distracted, so it took him that long to process the words, and then another moment to process the horror, while Bellatrix continued speaking. I would. Please, my lord, I would very much rather die, her voice said. And then, in a smaller voice, a whisper that was barely there, but I will go back if you ask it of me, my lord. We are not going back to your cell, hissed Harry's voice, on automatic. Nothing of what he felt was allowed to reach his face. Said Hufflepuff. Did you seriously just think, you ought to work for me, I would appreciate you? A stone would respond to that kind of loyalty, Harry thought. Even if I'm only getting it by mistake, I can't help but. She's the Dark Lord's loyal killer and torturer, and the supposed reason she's loyal is because an innocent girl was broken into pieces and used as raw material to make her, said Hufflepuff. Did you forget? If someone shows me that much loyalty, even by mistake, there's a part of me that can't help but feel something. The Dark Lord must have been. Evil doesn't seem like a strong enough word, he must have been empty. To not appreciate her loyalty, artificial or not. The better parts of Harry didn't have much to say to that. And that was when Harry heard it. It was faint, and it grew louder with every step they took forward. A woman's voice, distant, indistinct. His ears, automatically, strained to make out the words. Please don't. Didn't mean. Don't die. Then his brain knew who he was hearing, and in almost the same moment, figured out what he was hearing. Because Professor Quirrell wasn't there to keep the silence anymore, and Azkaban was not, in fact, silent. Faint the woman's voice, repeating. No, I didn't mean it, please don't die. No, I didn't mean it, please don't die. It got louder with every step Harry took, he could hear the emotion in the words now, the horror, the remorse, the desperation of. No, I didn't mean it, please don't die. The woman's worst memory, rehearsing over and over again. No, I didn't mean it, please don't die. The murder that had sent her to Azkaban. No, I didn't mean it, please don't die. Where she was sentenced by the Dementors to watch whoever she'd killed die and die and die in an infinite repeating loop. Though she must have been put in Azkaban recently, from the amount of life left in her voice. The thought came to Harry, then, that Professor Quirrell had passed those doors, heard those sounds, and given not the slightest sign of disturbance, and Harry would have called it a positive proof of evil, if Harry's own lips hadn't remained silent in the presence of Bellatrix, his breathing regular, while something inside him screamed and screamed and screamed. The Patronus brightened, not out of control, but it brightened, with every step Harry took forward. It brightened further as Harry and Bellatrix descended the stairs. She stumbled and Harry offered her his left arm thrust outside the cloak, braving the sense of doom from being that close to the snake draped around her neck. There was a surprised look on her face, but she accepted it, and said nothing. It helped Harry, being able to help Bellatrix, but it wasn't enough. Not when he saw the huge metal door in the center of that level's corridor. Not when they came closer, and the woman's voice fell silent, because there was a Patronus near her now, and she wasn't reliving her worst memory anymore. Good, said a voice inside him. That was step one. Harry's steps carried him inevitably forward toward the metal door. And. Now unlock the door. Harry kept walking. What do you think you're doing? Go back and get her out of there. Kept walking. Save her. What are you doing? She's hurting, you have to save her. The portkey Harry was carrying could transport 2 humans, only 2, plus or minus a snake. If they'd had Professor Quirrell's portkey too. But they didn't. Professor Quirrell's human form was carrying that, there was no way to get it. Harry could only save one person today, and there was only one person on the lowest level of Azkaban, in the most desperate need. Don't go. The voice came in a scream from behind the metal door. No, don't go, don't take it away, don't. There was a light in the corridor and it grew brighter. Please, sobbed the woman's voice, please, I can't remember my children's names anymore. Sit down, Bella, Harry's voice said. Somehow he kept his voice in a cold whisper. I must deal with this, the hover charm diminishing and switching off even as Bella obediently sat down, her skeletal form dark against the brightening air. I'll die, thought Harry. The air went on brightening. After all, it wasn't a certainty that Harry would die. It was just a probability of death, and weren't some things worth a probability of dying? The air went on brightening, the greater Patronus was beginning to form around him, the brilliant human shape was becoming indistinct within the burning air, as Harry's life went to feed the fire. If I wipe out the Dementors, then even if I live, they'll know it was me, that I was the one who did this. I'll lose my support, lose the war. Yeah, said the inner voice that was urging him on. After you destroy all the Dementors in Azkaban. I'd think that'd tend to prove your credentials as a Light Lord, actually, so save her, you have to save her. The humanoid shape could no longer be seen as a separate entity. The corridor couldn't be seen. Harry's own body was invisible within the cloak. There was only a bodiless viewpoint within an infinite expanse of silver light. Harry could feel the life leaving him, fueling the spell. Far away, he could feel the shadows of death begin to fray. I meant to accomplish more with my life than this. I was going to fight the Dark Lord, I was going to merge the Wizarding and Muggle worlds. Lofty goals seemed very distant, very abstract, compared to one woman begging him for help. It wasn't certain that Harry would ever do anything more important than this one thing that he could do now and here. And with what might have been his last breath, Harry thought. There are other Dementors, probably other Azkabans. If I'm going to do this, I should do it when I'm closer to the central pit. It will take less of my life that way, which increases the probability that I'll survive to destroy other Dementors. Even assuming this is the optimal thing to do, if there's a right time and place to do this, it isn't now and here, it isn't now and here. What? Said the other part of him indignantly, as it searched for a counter-argument that didn't exist. Slowly the light died back down, as Harry concentrated on that one indisputable fact, the one obvious truth that they weren't in the optimal place, the time couldn't be now. Slowly the light died back down. Part of Harry's life flowed back into him. Part had been lost as radiation. But Harry had enough left to stay on his feet, and keep the silver human shape bright, and when his wand arm raised and his voice whispered, Wingardium Leviosa, the magic flowed obediently out of him and helped Bellatrix to her feet. For it wasn't his magic he had expended, it had never been his magic that fueled the Patronus charm. I swear, Harry thought, breathing as regularly as he could in Bellatrix's presence, while tears streamed down his invisible cheeks, I swear upon my life and my magic and my art as a rationalist, I swear by everything I hold sacred and all my happy memories, I give my oath that someday I will end this place, please, please may I be forgiven. And the two of them walked on, as a murderess's voice screamed and begged someone to come back and save her. There should have been more time, there should have been a ceremony, for Harry's sacrifice of that piece of himself, but Bellatrix was beside him and so Harry just had to keep on walking without a pause, saying nothing, breathing evenly. So Harry walked on, leaving a piece of himself behind. It would dwell in this place and time forever, he knew. Even after Harry came back someday with a company of other true Patronus casters and they destroyed all the Dementors here. Even if he melted the triangular building and burned the island low enough that the sea would wash over it, leaving no trace that such a place as this had ever once existed. Even then he wouldn't get it back. The flock of luminous creatures stopped staring downward, and began patrolling the metal corridor as if nothing had happened. Just like last time, Director Bones snapped in the direction of Auror Li, and the young Auror replied, yes, ma'am. The director fired off another query to see if the Dementors could now find their target, and looked unsurprised to hear a negative reply a few seconds later. Emmeline Vance was feeling torn between her loyalties. Emmeline wasn't a member of the Order of the Phoenix anymore, they had disbanded after the end of the last war. And during the war, they'd all known, that Director Crouch had quietly approved of their off-the-books battle. Director Bones wasn't Crouch. But they were hunting Bellatrix Black now, who had been a Death Eater, and who was certainly being rescued by Death Eaters. Their Patronuses were behaving oddly, all the bright creatures stopping and staring off downward, before they'd gone back to following their masters. And the Dementors couldn't find their target. It seemed to her that this would be an extremely good time to consult Albus Dumbledore. Should she just suggest to Director Bones that they contact Dumbledore? But if Director Bones hadn't contacted him already? Emmeline wavered for a while, probably too long, and then finally decided. The hell with it, she thought. We're all on the same side, we need to stick together whether Director Bones likes it or not. At a thought, her silver sparrow fluttered onto her shoulder. Drop behind us to guard our rear, Emmeline murmured softly, almost without moving her lips, wait until no one is looking directly at you, then go to Albus Dumbledore. If he is not already by himself, wait until he is. And tell him this, Bellatrix Black is breaking out of Azkaban, and the Dementors cannot find her. 56. TSP, Constrained Optimization, PT6. Silent, it was thankfully silent, the metal door on the next level down. Either there wasn't someone behind there, or they were hurting quietly, maybe they were screaming but their voice had given out already, or they were just muttering quietly to themselves in the dark. I'm not sure I can do this, Harry thought, and he couldn't blame the despairing thought on the Dementors either. It would be better to be lower, safer to be lower. His plan would take time to implement and the Aurors were probably already working their way down. But if Harry had to pass any more of those metal doors while staying silent and keeping his breathing perfectly regular, he might go mad. If he had to leave a piece of himself behind at each one, soon there wouldn't be anything left of him. A luminous moonlit cat leapt into existence and landed in front of Harry's Patronus. Harry almost screamed, which wouldn't have helped his image with Bellatrix. Harry, said the voice of Professor McGonagall, sounding as alarmed as Harry had ever heard from her. Where are you? Are you all right? This is my Patronus, answer me. With a convulsive effort, Harry cleared his mind, repurposed his throat, forced calm, swapped in a different personality like an occlumency barrier. It took a few seconds and he hoped like hell that Professor McGonagall didn't notice a problem with that thanks to the communications delay, just as he hoped like hell that Patronuses didn't report on their surroundings. A young boy's innocent voice said, I'm in Mary's place, Professor, in Diagon Alley. Going to the restroom actually. What's wrong? The cat leapt away, and Bellatrix began to chuckle softly, dusty appreciative laughter, but she cut herself off abruptly at a hiss from Harry. A moment later the cat returned, and said in Professor McGonagall's voice, I'm coming to pick you up right now. Don't go anywhere. If you're not around the defense professor, don't go back to him, don't say anything to anyone, I'll be there as quickly as I can. And the bright cat blurred forward and vanished. Harry glanced down at his watch, noting down the time, so that after he got everyone out of here, and Professor Quirrell anchored the time turner again, he could go back and be in the restroom of Mary's place at the appropriate time. You know, said the problem-solving part of his brain, there's a limit to how many constraints you can add to a problem before it really is impossible, you know that. It shouldn't have mattered, and it didn't compare to the suffering of a single prisoner in Azkaban, and yet Harry still found himself feeling very aware that if his plan didn't end with him being picked up from Mary's place just like he'd never left, and the defense professor looking completely innocent of any and all wrongdoing, Professor McGonagall was going to kill him. As their team prepared to eat another bite of territory out of C Spiral, shielding and scanning before dispelling the previous shield to their rear, Amelia was tapping her fingers on her hip and wondering if she ought to consult the obvious expert. If only he wasn't so. Amelia heard the familiar crack of fire and knew what she would see as she turned. A third of her Aurors were spinning around and leveling their wands on the old wizard in half-moon glasses and a long silver beard who had appeared directly within their midst, a bright red golden phoenix on his shoulder. Hold your fire. Polyjuice made it easy to forge the face, but faking the phoenix travel would have been rather more difficult. The wards permitted it as one of the fast ways into Azkaban, though there were no fast ways out. The old witch and the old wizard stared at each other for a long moment. Amelia wondered, in the back of her mind, which of her Aurors had sent the word. There were several former members of the Order of the Phoenix with her. She tried to remember, in the back of her mind, if she'd seen Emmeline's sparrow or Andy's cat missing from the flock of bright creatures, but she knew that it was futile. It might not even be any of her people, for the old meddler often knew things he had no way at all of knowing. Albus Dumbledore inclined his head to Amelia in a courteous gesture. I hope I am not unwelcome here, the wizard said calmly. We are all on the same side, are we not? That depends, Amelia said in a hard voice. Are you here to help us catch criminals, or to protect them from the consequences of their actions? Are you going to try to stop the killer of my brother from getting her well-deserved kiss, old meddler? From what Amelia heard, Dumbledore had gotten smarter toward the end of the war, mostly due to Mad Eye's non-stop nagging, but had relapsed into his foolish mercies the instant Voldemort's body was found. A dozen small points of white and silver, reflections of the shining animals, gleamed off the old wizard's half-moon glasses as he spoke. Even less than you would I see Bellatrix Blackfried, the old wizard said. She must not leave this prison alive, Amelia. Before Amelia could speak again, even to express her surprised gratification, the old wizard gestured with his long black wand and a blazing silver phoenix sprang into existence, brighter perhaps than all their other Patronuses put together. It was the first time she'd seen that spell cast wordlessly. Order all your Aurors to cancel their Patronus charms for 10 seconds, said the old wizard. What darkness cannot find, the light may. Amelia snapped off the order to the communications officer, who would notify all Aurors through their mirrors, commanding Dumbledore's will to be done. That took a few moments, and it became a period of awful silence, none of the Aurors daring to speak, while Amelia tried to weigh her own thoughts. She must not leave this prison alive. Albus Dumbledore wouldn't turn into Bartemius Crouch without a strong reason. If he'd meant to tell her why, he already would have, but it certainly wasn't a positive sign. Still, it was good to know they'd be able to work together on this one. Now, said a chorus of mirrors, and all the Patronus charms winked out except that blazing silver phoenix. Is there another Patronus still present? The old wizard said clearly to the bright creature. The bright creature dipped its head in a nod. Can you find it? The silver head nodded again. Will you remember it, should it depart and come again? A final nod from the blazing phoenix. It is done, Dumbledore said. Over, said all the mirrors a moment later, and Amelia raised her wand and began recasting her own Patronus. Though it took some extra concentration, with that wolfish smile already on her face, to think of the first time Susan had kissed her cheek, instead of dwelling on the looming fate of Bellatrix Black. That other kiss was a happy thought indeed, but not quite the right kind for the Patronus charm. They hadn't even gotten to the end of that corridor before Harry's Patronus raised its hand, politely, as though in a classroom. Harry thought quickly. The question was how to. No, that was also obvious. It seems, Harry said in a coldly amused voice, that someone has instructed this Patronus to speak its message only to me. He chuckled. Well then, pardon me, dear Bella. Quietus. At once the silver humanoid said in Harry's own voice, there is another Patronus which seeks this Patronus. What? Said Harry. And then, without pausing to think about what was happening, can you block it? Stop it from finding you. The silver humanoid shook its head. No sooner did Amelia and the other Aurors finish recasting their Patronus charms, when the blazing silver phoenix flew off, and the true red golden phoenix followed it, and the old wizard calmly strode after both of them with his long wand gripped low. The shields around their territory parted around the old wizard like water, and closed behind him with hardly a ripple. Albus, shouted Amelia, what do you think you're doing? But she already knew. Do not follow me, the old wizard's voice said sternly. I can protect myself, I cannot protect others. The curse Amelia shouted after him made even her own Aurors flinch. This isn't fair, isn't fair, isn't fair. There's a limit to how many constraints you can add to a problem before it really is impossible. Harry blocked off the useless thoughts, ignored the fatigue he was feeling, and forced his mind to confront the new requirements. He had to think fast, use the adrenaline on following the chains of logic quickly and without hesitation, instead of wasting it on despair. For the mission to succeed. 1. Harry would have to dispel his Patronus. 2. Bellatrix needed to be hidden from the Dementors after the Patronus was dispelled. 3. Harry needed to resist the Dementor's drain after his Patronus was dispelled. If I solve this one, said Harry's brain, I want a cookie afterward, and if you make the problem any more difficult than this, I mean the slightest bit more difficult, I am climbing out of your skull and heading for Tahiti. Harry and his brain considered the problem. Azkaban had stood invincible for centuries, relying upon the impossibility of evading the Dementor's gaze. So if Harry found another way to hide Bellatrix from the Dementors, it would rely on either his scientific knowledge or his realization that the Dementors were death. Harry's brain suggested that an obvious way to stop the Dementors from seeing Bellatrix was to make her stop existing, i.e., kill her. Harry congratulated his brain on thinking outside the box and told it to continue searching. Kill her and then bring her back, came the next suggestion. Use Frigidaire to cool Bellatrix down to the point where her brain activity stops, then warm her up afterward using thermos, just like people who fall into very cold water can be successfully revived half an hour later without noticeable brain damage. Harry considered this. Bellatrix might not survive in her debilitated state. And it might not stop death from seeing her. And he'd have trouble carrying a cold unconscious Bellatrix very far. And Harry couldn't remember the research on which exact body temperature was supposed to be non-fatal but temporarily brain-halting. It was another good outside-the-box idea, but Harry told his brain to keep thinking of ways to hide from death. A frown moved over Harry's face. He'd heard something about that, somewhere. One of the requisites for becoming a powerful wizard is an excellent memory, Professor Quirrell had said. The key to a puzzle is often something you read 20 years ago in an old scroll, or a peculiar ring you saw on the finger of a man you met only once. Harry focused as hard as he could, but he couldn't remember. It was on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't remember, so he told his subconscious to go on trying to recollect it, and refocused his attention on the other half of the problem. How can I protect myself from the Dementors without a Patronus charm? The headmaster had been repeatedly exposed to a Dementor from a few steps away, over and over throughout a whole day, and had come out of it looking merely tired. How had the headmaster done that? Could Harry do it too? It could just be some random genetic thing, in which case Harry was screwed. But assuming the problem was solvable, then the obvious answer was that Dumbledore wasn't afraid of death. Dumbledore really wasn't afraid of death. Dumbledore honestly, truly believed that death was the next great adventure. Believed it in his core, not just as convenient words used to suppress cognitive dissonance, not just pretending to be wise. Dumbledore had decided that death was the natural and normative order, and whatever tiny lingering fear was still in him, it had taken a long time and repeated exposures for the Dementor to drain him through that small flaw. That avenue was closed to Harry. And then Harry thought of the flip side, the obvious inverse question. Why am I so much more vulnerable than average? Other students didn't fall over when they faced the Dementor. Harry meant to destroy death, to end it if he could. He meant to live forever, if he could, he had hope of it. The thought of death brought him no sense of despair or inevitability. He was not blindly attached to his own life, indeed it had taken an effort not to burn away all his life on the need to protect others from death. Why did the shadows of death have such power over Harry? He would not have thought himself so afraid. Was it Harry, all along, who'd been rationalizing? Who was secretly so afraid of death that it was twisting his own thoughts, as Harry had accused Dumbledore? Harry considered this, preventing himself from flinching away. It felt uncomfortable, but uncomfortable thoughts weren't always true, and this one didn't sound exactly right. Like there was a grain of truth, but it wasn't hiding where the hypothesis said it was. And that was when Harry realized. Oh, I understand now. The one who is afraid, is. Harry asked his dark side what it thought of death. And Harry's Patronus wavered, dimmed, almost went out upon the instant, for that desperate, sobbing, screaming terror, an unutterable fear that would do anything not to die, throw everything aside not to die, that couldn't think straight or feel straight in the presence of that absolute horror, that couldn't look into the abyss of non-existence any more than it could have stared straight into the sun, a blind terrified thing that only wanted to find a dark corner and hide and not have to think about it anymore. The silver figure had darkened to moonlight, was flickering like a failing candle. It's all right, thought Harry, it's all right. Visualizing himself cradling his dark side like a frightened child in his arms. It's right and proper to be horrified, because death is horrible. You don't have to hide your horror, you don't have to feel ashamed of it, you can wear it as a badge of honor, openly in the sun. It was strange to feel himself split in two like this, the track of his thoughts that gave the comfort, the track of his thoughts that followed his dark side's incomprehension at the alienness of the ordinary Harry's thoughts, of all the things that his dark side associated with its own fear of death, the one thing it had never expected or imagined that it might find, was acceptance and praise and help. You don't have to fight alone, Harry said silently to his dark side. The rest of me will back you up on this. I won't let myself die, and I won't let my friends die either. Not you, not Hermione, not Mum or Dad, not Neville or Draco or anyone, this is the will to protect. Visualizing wings of sunlight, like the wings of the Patronus he had spread, to give shelter to that frightened child. The Patronus brightened again, the world spun around Harry, or it was his own mind that was spinning. Take my hand, Harry thought and visualized, come with me, and we will do this thing together. There was a lurch in Harry's mind, like his brain had taken one step to the left, or the universe had taken one step to the right. And in a brightly lit corridor in Azkaban, the dim gas lights far outshone by the steady and unwavering light of a human-shaped Patronus, an invisible boy stood with a strange small smile on his face, shaking only slightly. Harry knew, somehow, that he'd just done something significant, something that went beyond just strengthening his resistance to Dementors. And more than that, he'd remembered. Thinking of death as an anthropomorphic figure had done the trick, ironically enough. Now Harry could remember it, what was reputed to hide someone from the gaze of death himself. In a corridor of Azkaban, a wizard's striding legs came to an abrupt halt, for the bright silver thing that was his guide had halted in midair, fluttering its wings in distress. The brilliant white phoenix craned its head, looking backward and forward as though confused, and then it turned to its master and shook its head in apology. Without another word, the old wizard turned and strode back the way he came. Harry stood straight and upright, feeling the fear wash over him and around him. Some tiny part of him might have been eroded a little by the waves of emptiness that broke continually upon his unmoving stone, but his limbs were not cold, and his magic was with him. In time those waves might corrode him and consume him, sneaking through whatever tiny part of him still cowered before death instead of using its fear to energize itself for battle. But that doom would take time, with the shadows of death far away and uncaring of him. The flaw, the crack, the fault line that was in him had been repaired, and the stars blazed brightly in his mind, vast and unafraid, and brilliant in the midst of cold and darkness. To anyone else's eyes, it would have seemed that the boy stood alone in the dimly lit metal corridor, wearing that strange smile. For Bellatrix Black and the snake draped around her shoulders were concealed by the cloak of invisibility, one of the three deathly hallows and reputed to hide its wearer from the gaze of death himself. The riddle whose answer had been lost, and which Harry had found anew. And Harry knew, now, that the concealment of the cloak was more than the mere transparency of disillusionment, that the cloak kept you hidden and not just invisible, as unseeable as were Thestrals to the unknowing. And Harry also knew that it was Thestral blood which painted the symbol of the deathly hallows on the inside of the cloak, binding into the cloak that portion of death's power, enabling the cloak to confront the Dementors on their own level and block them. It had felt like guessing, and yet a certain guess, the knowledge coming to him in the instant of solving the riddle. Bellatrix was still transparent within the cloak, but to Harry she was no longer hidden, he knew that she was there, as obvious to him as a Thestral. For Harry had only loaned his cloak, not given it, and he had comprehended and mastered the deathly hallow that had been passed down through the Potter line. Harry gazed directly at the invisible woman, and said, "Can the Dementors reach you, Bella?" "No," said the woman in a soft, wondering voice. Then, but my lord. If you say anything foolish, it will annoy me, Harry said coldly. Or are you under the impression that I would sacrifice myself for you? No, my lord, the Dark Lord's servant replied, sounding puzzled, and perhaps odd. Follow, spoke Harry's cold whisper. And they continued their journey downward, as the Dark Lord reached into his pouch, and took a cookie, and ate it. If Bellatrix had asked, Harry would have claimed it was for the chocolate, but she didn't ask. The old wizard strode back into the midst of the Aurors, the silver and the red golden phoenixes now following behind. Amelia began to bellow. They have dismissed their Patronus, said Dumbledore. The old wizard didn't seem to raise his voice, but his calm words somehow overrode her own. I cannot find them now. Amelia gritted her teeth, and put a number of scathing remarks on hold, and turned to the communications officer. Tell the duty room to ask the Dementors again if they can sense Bellatrix Black. The communications specialist spoke to her mirror for a moment, and a few seconds later, looked up, surprised. No. Amelia was already cursing violently in her mind. But they can see someone else on the lower levels who isn't a prisoner. Fine, snapped Amelia. Tell the Dementor that a dozen of its kind are authorized to enter Azkaban and seize whoever that is and anyone in their company. And if they see Bellatrix Black, they're to kiss her immediately. Amelia turned and glared toward Dumbledore, then, daring him to argue, but the old wizard only looked at her a bit sadly, and held his peace. Auror McCusker finished speaking to the corpse that drifted outside the window, conveying the director's orders. The corpse gave him a deathly smile that almost unstrung his limbs, and then floated downward. Soon after, a dozen Dementors arose from where they had drifted in the central pit of Azkaban, and headed outward, toward the walls of the vast metal structure that towered above them. Entering through holes set into the base of Azkaban, the darkest of all creatures began their march of horror. 57. TSP, Constrained Cognition, PT7. Harry had hoped that he'd just achieved fusion with his mysterious dark side and would be enabled to draw on all of its benefits with none of its drawbacks, call up the crystal clarity and indomitable will on demand, without needing to go cold or angry. Once again, he'd overestimated how much progress he'd made. Something had happened, but Harry still had a mysterious dark side, it was still separate from him, and his ordinary self was still domitable. And despite the repair work he'd done on his dark side's fear of death, he didn't dare go dark while unshielded in Azkaban. That was tempting fate way too much. Which was unfortunate, because a bit of non-domitability would have sure come in handy about now. What made it harder was that he couldn't slump against a wall, couldn't break into tears, couldn't even heave a sigh. His dear Bella was watching him, and that wasn't the sort of thing her Dark Lord would do. My lord, Bellatrix said. Her low voice was strained. The Dementors, they are coming, I can feel them, my lord. Thank you, Bella, said a dry voice, I already know that. Harry couldn't sense the holes in the world the same way as when he'd been wearing the Deathly Hallow, but he could feel the empty pull increasing in intensity. At first he'd mistaken it for the result of descending a stairwell, until he and Bellatrix had finished descending and the pull had gone on increasing. Then decreased, as the Dementors moved away along the spiral, then increased as they went up another flight of stairs. There were Dementors within Azkaban itself now, and they were coming for him. Of course they were. Harry might be resistant now, but he was not hidden. New requirement, Harry told his brain. Find a way of defeating Dementors that doesn't invoke my Patronus charm. Alternatively, find yet another way of hiding someone from Dementors, besides the cloak of invisibility. I quit, said his brain. Find yourself another piece of computing substrate to solve your ridiculously overconstrained problems. I mean it, thought Harry. So do I, said his brain. Put up your Patronus charm and wait for the Aurors to find you. Be sensible. It's over. Give up. The sucking emptiness seemed to pull harder, as he thought it, and Harry realized what was happening, concentrated more intensely on the stars, turned his mind away from the despair. You know, observe the logical side of him, if you're not allowed to think any negative thoughts because that will open your mind to the Dementors, that's a cognitive bias too, how would you know if it actually was time to give up? A desperate sobbing scream rose up from below, words mixed in like, no, and, away. The prisoners knew, the prisoners could feel it. The Dementors were coming. My lord, you should not risk yourself for me, take back your cloak. Be silent, fool, hissed an angry voice. When I decide to sacrifice you I will tell you so. She's got a valid point, said Slytherin. You shouldn't risk yourself for her, there's no way her life is as valuable as yours. For an instant Harry considered sacrificing Bellatrix to save himself. And in that moment, some of the dim orange gas light seemed to flee the corridor, a touch of cold crept over Harry's fingertips. And he knew, then, that to think of leaving Bellatrix to the shadows of death would make him vulnerable once more. Even in the moment of making the decision, he might become unable to cast the Patronus charm, for he would have given up the thought that had saved him before. It occurred to Harry that he could still take the cloak from Bellatrix afterward, even if he couldn't cast the Patronus charm, and then he had to wrench his thoughts away from that option, focus firmly on his decision not to do it, or he might have just fallen over where he stood. For the whirlpool of emptiness swirling around him was now deadly strong, there were screams coming from above, and the screams below had stopped. This is ridiculous, said his logical side. Rational agents shouldn't have to put up with this sort of censored reasoning process. All the theorems assume that how you think doesn't affect reality apart from your actual actions, which is why you're free to choose an optimal algorithm without worrying about how your thoughts interact with Dementors. That is a really dumb idea, said Gryffindor. Even I think it's a dumb idea, and I'm your Gryffindor side. You're not seriously going to just stand there and we have a fix, shouted Aura, holding up her magic mirror as though in triumph. The Dementor outside the inner wall pointed to level 7, see spiral, that's where they are. Her Aurors were looking at her expectantly. No, Amelia said in a level voice. That's where one of them is. The Dementors still can't find Bellatrix Black. We are not running down there and letting her through in the confusion, and we are not dividing our forces to be ambushed. So long as we move with caution, we can't lose. Tell Scrimgore and Shacklebolt to keep going down level by level, same as before. The old wizard was already striding forward. Amelia didn't even bother cursing him, this time, as once again their carefully constructed shields parted like water and rippled gently in his wake. Harry waited at the beginning of the corridor, just next to the stairs leading upward. Bellatrix and the snake were behind him, concealed by the deathly halo that Harry had mastered. He knew, though he could not see, that the emaciated sorceress was sitting upon the stairs, slumped back, since Harry had withdrawn his hover charm to free up his mind and magic. Harry's eyes were fixed on the far end of the corridor, next to the stairs that led downward. Not in his mind now, but in true reality, the light in the corridor had dimmed, the temperature had fallen. The fear thundered over him and around him like a sea whipped by hurricane winds, and the sucking emptiness had become a howling draw towards some approaching black hole. Up the stairs at the far end, floating smoothly through the dying air, came the voids, the absences, the wounds in the world. And Harry expected them to stop. With all the will and focus he could muster, Harry expected them to stop. Anticipated their stopping. Believed they would stop. That was the idea, anyway. Harry shut down the dangerous stray thought, and expected the Dementors to halt. They had no intelligence of their own, they were just wounds in the world, their form and structure was borrowed from others' expectations. People had been able to negotiate with them, offer them victims in exchange for cooperation, only because they believed Dementors would bargain. So if Harry believed hard enough that the voids would turn and go, they would turn and go. But the wounds in the world kept coming, the swirling fear seemed like a solid thing now, the emptiness tearing at matter as well as mind, substance as well as spirit, you could see the metal beginning to tarnish as the holes in the world passed. A small sound came from behind him, from Bellatrix, but she said no word, for she had been instructed to remain silent. Don't think of them as creatures, think of them as psychosensitive objects, they can be controlled if I can control myself. The problem was that he couldn't control himself so easily, couldn't make himself believe blue was green by an act of will. Couldn't suppress all those thoughts about how irrational it was to make yourself believe something. How impossible it was to trick yourself into believing something if you knew that was what you were doing. All the training Harry had given himself against self-deception was refusing to switch off no matter how harmful it was in this unique special case. The shadows of death crossed the halfway point of the corridor, and Harry held up his hand, fingers spread, and said in a voice of firm and confident command, "Stop." The shadows of death stopped. Behind Harry, Bellatrix gave a strangled gasp, like it was being torn out of her. Harry gestured to her, the signal he had set up in advance, which meant, repeat what you heard the Dementors say. They say, Bellatrix said, her voice was shaking, they said, Bellatrix Black was promised us. Tell us where she hides, and you will be spared. Bellatrix, Harry said, making his voice sound amused. She escaped a while ago. A moment later, Harry realized that he should have said that Bellatrix was among the Aurors in the top level, that would have caused more confusion. No, it was wrong to think of the Dementors as trickable, they were merely things, they were controlled only by expectations. They say, Bellatrix said in a cracked voice, they say they know you're lying. The voids began to move forward again. Her anticipations are more solidly believed than mine, she is controlling them, unwittingly. Don't resist, Harry said, pointing his wand behind him. I love you, farewell, my lord. Somnium. It had helped, strangely enough, hearing those particular awful words, understanding Bellatrix's mistake, it reminded Harry why he was fighting. Stop, Harry said again. Bellatrix was asleep, now only his own will, his own expectations rather, should control those spheres of annihilation. But they kept on gliding forward, and Harry couldn't stop himself from worrying that the previous experience had damaged his confidence, which meant that he wouldn't be able to stop them, and as he noticed himself thinking that, he doubted even more. He needed more time to prepare, really ought to practice controlling just one Dementor in a cage first. There was only a quarter of corridor now between Harry and the shadows of death. The empty winds were so strong that Harry could feel the erosion beginning in the cracks of himself. And the thought came to Harry that maybe he was wrong, maybe Dementors did have their own desires and planning capability. Or maybe they were controlled by how everyone thought they worked, not just whoever was closest to them. And in either case, Harry drew up his wand into the starting position for the Patronus charm, and spoke. One of your number went to Hogwarts and did not return. It no longer exists, that death is dead. The Dementors halted, a dozen wounds in the world stood motionless, while the emptiness screamed around them like a deadly wind to nowhere. Turn and go and do not speak of this to anyone, little shadows, or I will destroy you as well. Harry's fingers slid into the starting position for the Patronus charm, and readied himself to cast it. In his mind, the earth shone among the stars, the day side bright and blue with reflected sunlight, the night side glimmering with the light of human cities. Harry wasn't bluffing, wasn't trying to do anything tricky with his thoughts. The shadows of death would move forward and be annihilated, or they would depart. He was equally ready for either. And the voids retreated back as smoothly as they came, the winds of nothingness lessening with each meter they traversed, as they slid back down the stairs, and departed. Whether they truly had their own pseudo-intelligence, or whether Harry had finally succeeded in expecting them to go, that, Harry didn't know. But they were gone. Harry took a moment to sit down beside the unconscious Bellatrix on the stairs, and slumped down as she was slumped, closing his eyes for a moment, only a moment. He sure as hell wasn't planning to sleep in Azkaban, but he needed to take that moment. The Aurors would still be going down the stairs slowly, Harry hoped, so it wouldn't hurt to take just 5 minutes to rest. Harry was careful to keep his thoughts positive, cheerful. I'll just have some nice regenerative rest here, and then I'll feel better, rather than, say, I'll just collapse in emotional and physical exhaustion, because the Dementors hadn't yet retreated very far. And by the way, Harry said to his brain, you're fired. I found him, cried the old wizard's voice. Who? Thought Amelia, as she turned to see Dumbledore's return, carrying in his arms the one sight, the one person, she would never have expected to behold. A man in torn red robes, looking scorched like he'd fought a small war, blood dried on many cuts. His eyes were open, and he was chewing on a bar of chocolate, held in his one living hand. Barry one hand was alive. A glad cry went up, her Aurors lowering their wands, some of them already starting to rush forward. Stay on guard, bellowed Amelia. Check them both for polyjuice, scan Barry for small animagi or traps. Enervate. Wingardium Leviosa. There was a pause. Harry sensed, though he could not quite see, that the invisible woman was pushing herself to her feet, and turning her head to look around. I'm alive. Harry was sorely tempted to say no, just to see what she made of that. Instead he hissed, don't ask stupid questions. What happened? Whispered Bellatrix. And the Dark Lord gave a wild, high-pitched laugh, and said, I scared the Dementors away, my dear Bella. There was a pause. Harry wished he could see Bellatrix's face, had he said the wrong thing. After a time, in a quavering voice, could it be, my lord, that in your new form, you have begun to care for me? No, Harry said coldly, and turned from her, though he kept his wand on her, and began walking. And take care that you do not offend me again, or I will abandon you here, use or no use. Now follow, or be left behind, I have work to do. Harry strode forward, not listening to the gasping sounds that came from behind him. He knew Bellatrix was following. Because the last thing that woman needed, the very last thing she needed to start thinking before the psychiatric healer began trying to deprogram her, was to believe that her Dark Lord could ever love her back. The old wizard smoothed his silver beard contemplatively, looking at where Auror Barry was being carried out of the room by two strong Aurors. Do you understand this, Amelia? No, she said simply. She suspected some trap they hadn't yet been able to fathom, which was why Auror Barry was going to be kept outside the main party and guarded. Perhaps, the old wizard said at length, whichever of their number can cast the Patronus charm, is more than a simple hostage. Someone who was tricked into this, mayhap. For whatever reason, they left your Auror alive. Let us not be the first to wield deadly curses, when we find them. I see, said the old witch in sudden realization, that was their plan. It costs them nothing to obliterate him and leave him alive, and makes us hesitate. Amelia nodded decisively, and said to her people, we carry on as before. The old wizard sighed. Any news from the Dementors? If I tell you, Amelia snapped, will you run off again? It costs you nothing, Amelia, the old wizard said quietly, and may save one of your own people the fight. Costs me nothing except my chance at vengeance. But that was nothing compared to the other. The annoying old wizard was often right in the end. It was part of what made him so annoying. The Dementors have ceased to answer questions about the other person they said they saw, Amelia told him, and they will not say why, nor where. Dumbledore turned to the blazing silver phoenix on his shoulder, whose light illuminated the whole corridor, and received a silent headshake in reply. I cannot detect them either, said Dumbledore. Then he shrugged. I suppose I shall just walk the whole spiral from top to bottom and see if anything turns up, shall I? Amelia would have ordered him not to do it, if she thought that would have made the tiniest difference. Albus, said Amelia as the old wizard turned to depart, even you can be ambushed. Nonsense, my dear, the old wizard said cheerfully as he strode off yet again, waving as though in admonition his 15-inch wand of unidentifiable dark gray wood. I'm invincible. There was a pause. He didn't just really say that, whispered the newest Auror present, a still prim young lady by the name of Noelle Curry, to the senior member of her trio, Auror Brooks. Did he? He can get away with it, Isabel whispered back to her, he's Dumbledore, not even fate takes him seriously anymore. And that, Amelia said heavily, for the benefit of the younger Aurors, is why we never call him in on anything unless we absolutely must. Harry lay very still on the hard bench that served as the bed of this cell, a blanket pulled over him, staying as absolutely motionless as he could while he waited for the fear to return. There was a Patronus approaching, and a powerful one. Bellatrix was hidden by a deathly halo, no easy charm would penetrate that, but Harry did not know what other arts the Aurors might employ to detect his own self, and dared not reveal his ignorance by asking her. So Harry lay on a hard bed, in a cell with a locked door, and the mighty metal door locked behind him, in absolute darkness, with a thin blanket pulled over him, hoping that whoever it was wouldn't look in, or wouldn't look too closely if they did. That wasn't a point Harry could affect, really, that part of his fate lay entirely in the hands of the hidden variables. Most of his mind was concentrating on the ongoing transfiguration he was performing. Listening in the silence, Harry heard the quick footsteps approach, they paused outside his door, and then continued onward. Soon the fear returned. Harry didn't allow himself to notice his own relief, any more than he allowed himself to notice the fear. He was holding in his mind the form of a muggle device rather larger than a car battery, and slowly applying that form to the substance of an ice cube, which Harry had frozen using Frigidaire on water from a bottle in his pouch. You weren't supposed to transfigure things to be burned, but between the original substance being water, and the bubblehead charm to protect their air supply, Harry hoped that this wouldn't make him or anyone else sick. Now it was just a question of whether there would be enough time before the Aurors did a detailed check on this cell block for Harry to finish this transfiguration, and the partial transfiguration he would do after that. When the old wizard strode back empty-handed, even Amelia began to feel a twinge of worry. She and the other two Auror teams had worked a third of the way down the 3 spirals, in synchrony so as not to allow any gap in their coverage that could be jumped by cutting through a ceiling, and they'd yet to find any sign. Might I ask you to report? Amelia said, keeping the edge out of her voice. First a simple walk from top to bottom, said the old wizard. He was frowning, wrinkling his face even more than usual. I examined Bellatrix's cell, and found a death doll left in her place. This escape was meant to go unremarked, I think. There is something hidden in the corner beneath a scrap of cloth, I left that undisturbed for your Aurors to examine. On the return trip, I opened each door and looked within the cells. I saw nothing disillusioned, only the prisoners. They were interrupted by a scream from the red golden phoenix, and all her Aurors flinched from it. Condemnation was in it, and an urgent demand that almost started Amelia running from the corridor on the spot. In rather distressing condition, Dumbledore said quietly. For a moment the blue eyes were very cold beneath the half-moon glasses. Will any of you speak to me of the consequences of their actions? I did not, Amelia began. I know, said the old wizard. My apologies, Amelia. He sighed. Some of the more recent prisoners had scraps of their magic left when I looked upon them, but I sensed no uneaten power, the strongest had only as much magic left as a first-year child. I heard Fawkes scream in distress many times, but never challenge. It seems you shall have to continue your search, they can hide well enough to escape my mere glance. When Harry finished his first transfiguration, he sat up, pulled back the blanket that had covered him, cast a quick lumos, glanced at his watch, and was shocked to see that nearly an hour and 30 minutes had passed. How much of that time had gone by since someone had opened the door and then closed it again? Harry hadn't been looking in that direction, of course, that, Harry couldn't guess. My lord, whispered Bellatrix's voice, soft and very tentative. You may speak now, Harry said. He'd told her to remain silent while he worked. That was Dumbledore who looked upon us. Pause. Interesting, Harry said neutrally. He was glad he had not noticed this at the time. That sounded like a rather close shave. Harry said a word to his pouch, and began drawing forth the magical device that he would mate to the product of his hour's labor. Then, when that was drawn forth, another word brought forth a tube of industrial-strength glue. Before using it, Harry cast the bubblehead charm on himself and Bellatrix, and had Bellatrix cast the same charm on the snake, so that the glue fumes in the enclosed cell would not harm them. When the glue had begun to set binding technology to magic, Harry laid it down upon the bed, and sat down on the floor, resting his magic and will for a moment before essaying the next transfiguration. My lord, Bellatrix said hesitantly. Yes, said the dry voice. What is that device you made? Harry thought rapidly. It seemed like a good chance to check his plans with her, under the guise of leading questions. Consider, my dear Bella, said Harry smoothly. How difficult is it for a powerful wizard to cut the walls of Azkaban? There was a pause, and then Bellatrix's voice came, slow and puzzled. Not difficult at all, my lord. Indeed, said the dry, high voice of Bella's master. Suppose one were to do this, and fly through the hole on a broomstick, and soar up and away. Rescuing a prisoner from Azkaban would seem easy then, would it not? But my lord, said Bella, the Aurors would, they have their own broomsticks, my lord, fast ones. Harry listened. It was as he had thought. The Dark Lord replied, again in tones of smoothly Socratic inquiry, and Bellatrix asked a further question, which Harry had not expected, but Harry's own counter-question showed that it should not matter in the end. And in response to Bellatrix's last question, the Dark Lord only smiled, and said that it was time for him to resume his work. And then Harry got up from the floor of the cell, went to the far end of the cells, and touched his wand to the hard surface of the wall of Azkaban, the solid metal that separated them from direct exposure to the Dementor's pit. And Harry began a partial transfiguration. This spell would go faster, Harry hoped. He'd spent hours and hours practicing the unique magic, which had made it routine, not much more difficult for him than ordinary transfiguration. The shape he was changing had not all that much total volume. The transfigured shape might be tall and wide and long, but it was very thin. Half a millimeter, Harry had thought, would be enough, considering the perfect smoothness. On the long bench that served as a prison bed, where Harry had set down the transfigured technological device and the mated magic item for the glue to dry, tiny letters in golden script gleamed on the Muggle artifact. Harry hadn't really planned for them to be there, but they'd kept running through the back of his mind, and so seemed to have become part of the transfigured form. There were many different things Harry could have said before using this particular triumph of technological ingenuity. Any number of things that would be, in one sense or another, appropriate. Or at least things that Harry could have said, would have said, if Bellatrix had not been there. But there was only one thing to say, that Harry would only get the chance to say just this once, and probably never get a better chance to say ever again. Or think, anyway, if he couldn't say it. He hadn't seen the actual movie, but he'd seen a preview, and for some reason the phrase had stuck in his mind. The tiny golden letters upon the Muggle device said, "All right, you primitive screwheads. Listen up.